Chapter 1. In the third year of Veronica's marriage to Thomas, he was lost on a mission. His twin brother, Manuel, returned carrying a bloodstained badge and, with a hoarse voice, told her, "Veronica, Thomas, he won't be coming back." She fainted immediately when she regained consciousness. She was desperate to find him, but her mother-in-law held her back firmly. Later, she swallowed sleeping pills, cut her wrists, and jumped into a river. 3 attempts at ending her life. 3 times she was saved. Everyone said, Captain Thomas and Comrade Veronica shared a truly deep affection. Yes, it really was wonderful. So wonderful that it was not until 3 months after he was presumed dead that she discovered it was not him who died at all. On the night Veronica was rescued from her 3rd suicide attempt, she arrived at her in-laws' home, her face pale, hoping to find some of Thomas's belongings to ease her sorrow. But from the room inside came the sound of low voices. "Thomas, how much longer are you going to keep this secret? Veronica has attempted suicide for you 3 times. Her fingers suddenly clenched tightly into her palm. Thomas. Why did her mother-in-law address her eldest uncle, Manuel, as Thomas? Mom, please wait a little longer. The voice was unmistakably Manuel's, yet the tone carried the same tender warmth Thomas used to soothe her before he died. My older brother entrusted me with taking care of my sister-in-law, but she is delicate. Hearing the tragic news of his death would surely be too much for her, so I had no choice but to assume my brother's identity to give her a child. With this child as her anchor, she could continue to live. Veronica's blood seemed to freeze instantly. She could hardly believe what she had just heard. So it was Manuel who died, not Thomas. Her husband was still alive, yet living under his brother's identity, sleeping next door every day, together with Fiona. But what about Veronica? Her mother-in-law's voice grew more urgent. You sleep in Fiona's room every day. Have you ever thought about how Veronica feels? She's stronger than the eldest sister-in-law. Those words stabbed her heart like a knife. She staggered backward but accidentally knocked over the broom leaning against the wall. Suddenly, the room fell into a heavy silence. But she turned and ran, as if a flood or a wild beast was chasing her from behind. As she ran, a sudden sting pricked her hand. Opening her palm, she saw that the badge, clenched too tightly, had cut her skin, and blood was seeping out. For 3 months, she had clutched that badge as she fell asleep each night, waking from dreams in tears more times than she could count. Yet now, it suddenly seemed so ridiculous. It turned out her husband was not dead. He had only chosen to let her believe he died, out of compassion for his sister-in-law. 5 years ago, she met Thomas for the first time at a military district celebration. He was the iron-hearted captain, and she was a dancer in the cultural troupe. Many had their eyes on him, and she had no shortage of admirers either. Yet that night, he stood in the crowd beneath the stage, his gaze intense as he watched her finish a performance of the Red Detachment of Women. Then, stepping onto the stage, before everyone, he gently laid his military coat over her shoulders. He said, "Comrade Veronica, it's windy, don't catch a chill." She wore his coat, her cheeks flushed with shyness. After that, he began to court her. Before every mission, he made a point to detour by the cultural troupe just to see her. On the day she agreed to be with him, he was utterly drunk, holding her as they spun around the yard, saying, "Veronica, Captain Thomas will only ever belong to you in this life." After they married, everyone said Captain Thomas loved his wife to his very soul. She once believed he loved her as if his life depended on it. But now, he took on his brother's identity to care for his sister-in-law, sharing a bed with her, even planning to father her child. And she, like a fool, wept for him, died for him, and was consumed by unbearable pain for him. Had he ever considered that she might feel pain too? When she returned home in a daze, Aunt Reyes, the matchmaker, arrived once again. "Veronica, Captain Albert will be transferred to the island in half a month. This is the 7th time he has sent me to inquire. He said that if you still refuse, he will never come back." Albert, Thomas's comrade in arms, since the day she was declared a widow, he had come knocking repeatedly to ask for her hand. She had refused him 6 times, because she believed that in this lifetime, she would only love Thomas. But now, she looked up calmly and said, "All right, I will marry. Aunt Reyes was stunned. Why, you're serious? I am. She smiled. Please tell Albert that in half a month, I will marry him and go with him to the island. The door curtain was suddenly thrown open. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face dark. Younger brother's wife. Who are you going to marry? Veronica looked at him and suddenly found it laughable. Big brother, she said softly. This is my own matter. He spoke to the matchmaker but grasped her wrist with a painfully strong grip. Your younger brother's wife has me to care for her and doesn't need to remarry. Besides, she loves Thomas so deeply. There's no way she'd remarry. Aunt Reyes, don't come here again, or don't blame me for driving you away. Aunt Reyes looked surprised, but Veronica has already agreed. Halfway through her sentence, Veronica quickly grabbed her arm. Aunt, didn't you say you were going to the supply and marketing cooperative? Please hurry, or it will be closed soon. Aunt Reyes was indeed interrupted, promptly replied, and quickly left. Seeing Aunt Reyes leave, Thomas finally breathed a sigh of relief. He took half a step forward, his Adam's apple moving. Younger brother's wife. Although Thomas is dead, rest assured, I will take care of you. When matchmakers come by again, just send them away immediately. At that moment, Veronica could only feel the absurdity of it all. He hid from her all day, sleeping in his elder brother's wife's room, yet still feared she would run away. Feared she would remarry? In this world, there is no logic like that. But she didn't expose him. She simply nodded. After all, she was going to remarry in half a month and leave this place forever. He wouldn't have any control over her then. At night, Veronica was packing her luggage when the wooden bed in the next room suddenly creaked. Before, whenever she heard such sounds, she simply thought it meant her eldest uncle and his wife were affectionate. But now, every breath feels like a blunt knife cutting into flesh. That was unmistakably Thomas's murmured groan of passion, a sound he would have made only in her ear. Ah! A scream tore through the night sky. As she rushed outside, she saw Thomas running out with a disheveled Fiona in his arms. In the moonlight, a glaring red stain spread across her pristine white pajamas. The residential compound for families instantly erupted in uproar, while the woman next door poked her head out. Oh my! What's happening here? I heard it got too intense during the procedure. And there was bleeding. TSK. Manuel usually seems so serious, but who knew he cared so deeply for his wife? Veronica stood among the crowd, a cold shiver running through her body. She turned to leave, but a woman grabbed her firmly. Veronica, you're the younger brother's wife. You must come and see for yourself. Fearing gossip, she had no choice but to throw on a coat and hurry to the hospital. In the hospital corridor, the sharp scent of disinfectant stung Veronica's eyes, making them water. Thomas paced anxiously, visibly startled when he saw her. Why are you here? Veronica twisted the corner of her mouth. As my younger brother's wife, I should come to see you. The operating room door suddenly opened, and the doctor stepped out. Comrade, rest assured, your spouse is fine. She is just pregnant. Intimacy must be restrained. Chapter 2. Veronica stood in the hospital corridor, a buzzing ringing in her ears. The doctor's words pregnant hit her like a heavy blow to the head. She instinctively glanced at Thomas, who was momentarily stunned before his eyes sparkled with wild joy as he whispered softly, "This is wonderful. Everything will return to its proper course." She fully understood the meaning behind those words. Fiona was pregnant. Finally, he could abandon the identity of Manuel and come back to her, but she no longer needed that. However, the patient is somewhat anemic and requires a blood transfusion. The doctor's words shattered her train of thought. Thomas immediately rolled up his sleeve but was stopped by the doctor. Your blood type doesn't match. Type B blood is needed. Veronica has type B blood. His gaze turned to Veronica, and after a brief hesitation, he approached her. Veronica, your sister-in-law is pregnant. This child has been long awaited. He hesitated, then said, would you be willing to donate blood for her? When the child is born, I promise I will repay you. Repay me? Veronica snorted quietly to herself. Was his so-called repayment nothing more than a begrudging return to her side? I can donate blood, but there's no need for repayment, she said calmly, then turned and followed the nurse to have her blood drawn. As the needle pierced her vein, She watched the deep red blood flow into the bag, and suddenly remembered the year of their honeymoon, when she had a high fever and Thomas carried her several miles through the night to the hospital. It was the same type of blood-drawing needle that day. He grasped her hand tightly and said, "Don't be afraid, my wife. I'm right here, now." Her blood was to flow into another woman's body, nurturing their child. Over the next few days, Veronica rested at home. Through the window, she saw Thomas not going to the military at all, carrying a thermos as he shuttled between home and the hospital every day. One day it was chicken soup, the next boiled eggs with brown sugar. Once, when she was bedridden with a cold, he too would stand by the stove, inventing all sorts of ways to help her regain her strength. On the day Fiona was discharged, the entire residential compound for families was suffused with the sweet fragrance of wedding candy. Thomas carried a jar of wedding candy, going door to door distributing it. His usually stern eyes were now bright with an unmistakable smile. "Fiona is pregnant. Please have some wedding candy. Congratulations. Congratulations. At last, a child to look forward to." He smiled in reply, the corners of his eyes and brows glowing with the joy of impending fatherhood. Only when he reached Veronica did he hesitate slightly, offering the candy with a faltering voice. "Sister-in-law, congratulations. Big brother." She took the candy, smiling just right. "Wishing your family of 3 happiness and harmony." Thomas furrowed his brow just slightly. Such a courteous blessing was too formal, so formal that it unsettled him deeply. Since Thomas's presumed sacrifice, Veronica had been either crying or throwing tantrums. When had she ever been this calm? Before he could think further, Fiona came over, linking her arm through his, and said coquettishly, "Manuel, didn't we agree to treat Veronica to dinner? To thank Veronica for donating blood." Fiona insisted on inviting her to dinner. She refused repeatedly, yet was still pulled into the car. In the state-run restaurant, the waiter greeted them warmly. "Please, the 3 of you, come inside." Her gaze shifted between Thomas and Fiona, and she smiled. "You two truly make a perfect match." Then she looked at Veronica. "This is your sister, right? She's quite striking." Thomas was taken aback, and before he could speak, he heard Veronica reply softly, "Yes, I am his sister." Those words pierced his heart like a knife, but seeing Fiona's slightly swollen belly, he ultimately said nothing to correct her. Chapter 3. When ordering, he fluently listed a string of dishes: no cilantro, less oil, less salt, something sour and spicy. All were Fiona's preferences. Only when the waiter asked, "What would the younger sister like to eat?" did he suddenly realize something and turn to look at Veronica. "Anything is fine with me." She lowered her head to sip the tea, the steam blurring her eyes and brow. Once the dishes were all served, Veronica mechanically picked at the rice, grain by grain. It wasn't until her throat suddenly tightened that she realized the glutinous rice balls in the bowl were filled with sesame. She is allergic to sesame. Thomas had once memorized all her dietary restrictions. Even when queuing at the cafeteria, he would specifically remind them not to add sesame. Yet now, he ordered a whole plate of sesame-filled glutinous rice balls. "Veronica." Fiona noticed her pale complexion and asked, "What's wrong with you?" Only then did Thomas look up, and upon seeing her flushed cheeks, he sprang to his feet. "You ate sesame?" Her breathing grew increasingly labored, and darkness closed in before Veronica's eyes. In a haze, she saw Thomas rushing toward her, only to be halted midway by Fiona's painful cry, "Ah, my stomach aches so badly." Time seemed to stand still in that moment. She saw Thomas frozen in place, his eyes flickering between her and Fiona. At last, he lifted Fiona and, hurrying away, instructed the waiter, "Please take my sister to the hospital." "Comrade? Comrade!" The waiter's panicked cries gradually faded away. Her consciousness blurred, and she completely lost awareness. The acrid smell of disinfectant burned Veronica's eyes. She opened her eyes to see a nurse changing the foredrip. "Comrade, are you awake?" The nurse breathed a sigh of relief. "Fortunately, the hotel waiter brought you here just in time. An allergic shock can be fatal." Veronica tried to speak but found her throat burning with pain. Thomas without hesitation held Fiona in his arms and left, the image haunting her endlessly. She closed her eyes, yet tears streaked down her temples. During the 3 days in the hospital, Veronica lay alone on the hospital bed. The rash from the allergy made her skin itch unbearably, and the swelling in her throat made even swallowing water impossible. In her most agonizing moment, she overheard the nurse whispering outside the door. The pregnant woman in room 308 is experiencing frequent fetal movements. Her husband is desperate, as if his world depended on it. Unlike the patient in room 302, suffering from severe allergies, her husband hasn't even looked at her once. As if she were already dead, Veronica buried her face in the pillow. Yes, her husband had long since been dead. Dead in that mission. 3 months ago, the moment he chose to live as someone else's husband. On the day of her discharge, the sunlight was bright and warm. Veronica had just reached the hospital entrance when she suddenly noticed that familiar military green Jeep. The next moment, Fiona stepped out of the hospital doors. The car door slammed open. Thomas rushed over in 3 swift steps, carefully supporting her waist. "Take it slow. The doctor said you need to rest more." His voice was so tender it seemed to drip with warmth, just like when he used to soothe her in the past. Veronica stood frozen in place, watching the Jeep speed away, its exhaust fumes blowing across her pale face. He didn't even spare her a single glance. The evening breeze carried a sharp chill. Veronica opened the door, and from a distance, she saw a tall figure standing on her doorstep. Thomas carried bags of supplements in his hands, with several mesh sacks at his feet containing malted milk, brown sugar, and canned goods. "Veronica," he hurried over, asking, "Is your allergy any better?" How painfully ironic. He ignored her in broad daylight, yet pretended to be affectionate when no one was watching. "Thank you for your concern, brother. I'm feeling much better now." She stepped past him and went to open the door. Thomas grasped her wrist firmly. "Take these to help you regain your strength." "No need. Manuel, there's trouble." Fiona rushed into the yard, tears streaming down her face. I've been reported for illicitly selling educated youth return quotas." Chapter 4. Veronica felt Thomas's hand stiffen noticeably. "What did you say?" His voice suddenly turned icy. Fiona sobbed, tears blurring her eyes. "I only wanted to earn some extra money to buy more clothes. Now the law enforcement unit is coming for me." Thomas' veins bulged on his forehead. "I give you my entire monthly allowance. And you still go do this kind of thing?" Fiona grabbed his sleeve and stamped her foot. "What do we do now? I'm pregnant. I can't go to jail." The courtyard gate suddenly burst open. 3 people wearing red armbands barged in. "Fiona Comrade, someone reported you for illegally selling educated youth return quotas. Please come with us." The air instantly became thick with tension. Thomas remained silent for a long moment, then suddenly said, "It wasn't her." Every eye was fixed on Thomas. The air seemed to freeze for a few seconds as he spoke each word deliberately. "I know about this matter. It wasn't Fiona, it was Veronica." The world seemed to stand still in that moment. "What did you say?" Veronica's voice trembled. "Say that again. Who was it?" He avoided her gaze, his Adam's apple moving. "It was Veronica." Veronica's voice shook, but before she could say another word, the law enforcement unit gripped her arm. "There are witnesses identifying you. Please cooperate with the investigation." As she was pushed onto the truck, Veronica stared intently at Thomas. He stood before Fiona in a crisp uniform, but he was no longer the man she remembered, the one who risked his life to protect her during the earthquake. In the dark room, Veronica's pleas fell on deaf ears. Captain Thomas himself made the identification. How could it be false? The law enforcement unit captain slammed a pen down before her. "Confess honestly." After 3 days without food or water, Veronica was sent to the coal mine for forced labor re-education. The mine was cold and damp. She carried a heavy coal basket on her back, each step like treading on knife's edge. Suddenly, a thunderous rumble echoed through the mine. "Collapse! Run!" Veronica had no time to react before the collapsing coal buried her lower body. Amidst excruciating pain, she heard someone crying out her name with a heart-wrenching desperation. "Veronica! Hold on!" Was it a hallucination? The man who had abandoned her now tore at the coal with his bare hands, his fingertips bleeding heavily. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." When Thomas carried her out, his voice shook uncontrollably as he called her name again and again. "Fiona is pregnant and can't endure this suffering. I had no choice but to push this onto you. Veronica, I'm not myself. I love you more than you love me. Once the child is born, I'll bring you home. Please wake up. I beg you to wake up. I can't live without you. Veronica felt like laughing. He was always like that, handing out a whip, then offering a candy. Her final sensation before losing consciousness was Thomas's burning tears falling on her face. When she woke again, the ward was completely silent. Thomas was sleeping beside the bed, dark stubble showing on his chin. The moment Veronica moved, he woke instantly in alarm. Veronica. He suddenly pulled her into his arms, his eyes red as he kissed her passionately on the lips. Thank God you're awake. Thank God. Big brother. Veronica pushed him away with all her strength. What are you doing? Chapter 5. Thomas suddenly released her, staggering back 2 steps as if he had been burned. Sorry. His Adam's apple bobbed. His voice was hoarse. Fiona was hospitalized these past days due to fetal movement. I entered the wrong room and mistook you for someone else. He turned and walked away, his figure fleeing in panic. Veronica raised her hand to wipe off the lingering warmth from her lips, feeling unbearably ironic. He didn't even know how to lie. It was broad daylight, yet he walked through the wrong door. How could he fail to recognize a person? Veronica stayed in the hospital for several days before completing her discharge. On the day of her discharge, it coincided with the Army's open day. As Veronica stepped into the family residential compound, she was immediately surrounded by several enthusiastic military wives. Veronica, it's been a while since Thomas passed away. You're so lonely on your own. It's time you moved on. Let me introduce you to someone suitable. Sister-in-law. Exactly. The youngest son of Staff Officer Zhang, a military academy graduate, and quite a gentleman. Veronica opened her mouth to say she had already accepted Albert's proposal, but was quickly pushed toward a young man in military uniform. Take a quick look. Comrade Joe works at the Research Institute. His home fully equipped with all 3 major appliances, and his monthly salary is 78 yuan. The young man pushed up his glasses, about to speak, when a shadow suddenly lunged forward and knocked him to the ground with a single punch. Everyone present was momentarily stunned. Veronica looked up and met a pair of blood-red eyes. Thomas had 3 buttons undone on his military uniform, his chest heaving violently. I am grateful for the kindness of the younger brother's wives. He spoke deliberately, his voice cold as ice. My younger brother's wife is under my care. There is no need for any of you to concern yourselves. After speaking, he grabbed Veronica's hand and started to walk away. Only after being pulled far away did Veronica suddenly wrench herself free. Manuel. She deliberately stressed the name. You're the one who's really sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Thomas's pupils contracted sharply. As for me and you, we have nothing to do with each other. She smoothed her twisted sleeve. Who I see or marry is entirely my own decision. She turned to leave but then heard a heavy thud behind her. Thomas slammed his fist into the tree trunk, blood trickling down between his fingers. Veronica walked away without a backward glance. Late at night, Veronica was jolted awake by a faint rustling sound. Before she could turn on the light, a burning hot body pressed down upon her. The sharp scent of alcohol mingled with a familiar pine fragrance as Thomas's lips crushed fiercely against hers. He was clearly drunk and incoherent. His kiss was fierce and urgent, as if he meant to consume her entirely. Veronica struggled desperately to push him away, but he gripped her wrist and pinned it above her head. Don't go. Thomas's voice was hoarse and broken, hot tears falling onto her face. Please, don't go on blind dates with others. Veronica trembled all over, unsure whether it was anger or shame. Thomas, you're Fiona's husband now. I'm not. He pressed his forehead against hers in anguish. Wait a little longer. Very soon. Get away. Veronica suddenly raised her knee sharply. Thomas grunted and fell off the bed. The noise startled the neighbors. Fiona pushed the door open. What's going on? The lights came on brightly. Veronica turned her face aside, her long hair concealing her bitten lip. Big brother got drunk and walked into the wrong room. Sister-in-law, please take him back. Fiona's eyes fell on Veronica's bloodied lips as her nails dug deep into her palm. But she said nothing, only gently and weakly helped Thomas to his feet. Manuel, let's go back to our room. Thomas staggered as he was pulled away. But at the doorway, he glanced back at Veronica. That look was like that of a beast on the brink of death. Veronica closed the door and slowly slid down to the floor. The wound on her lips burned fiercely, but even more painful was the place in her chest that had long been shattered and pierced. Chapter 6. The next day. Just as dawn was breaking, the sound of a car engine starting echoed through the courtyard. Veronica opened her eyes, listening to Thomas's car gradually fading away. Just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, the door was suddenly kicked open. Smack! A sharp slap landed heavily on her cheek, the burning pain immediate. Fiona stood by the bed, her eyes filled with venom. Veronica, you really are despicable. Your husband is dead, and you come seducing my uncle? What nonsense are you talking about? Veronica clutched her face, but in the next moment, she understood. It was last night. How absurd. Thomas was undeniably her lawful husband, their marriage sanctioned by the organization's certificate. Yet now, their intimacy is to be shattered by another woman's betrayal. You're mistaken. Last night it was him. Shut up. Fiona suddenly swept the candles off the nightstand. Don't think your looks can seduce another woman's husband. Today, I'll show you exactly who truly matters to him. Flames surged up the curtain, spreading instantly. Are you out of your mind? Veronica jumped out of bed to flee, but Fiona gripped her wrist firmly. What's the hurry? Fiona sneered. Do you think I'd die with you? She leaned close to Veronica's ear, her voice icy. Before I came, I had someone call Thomas. Tell me, who do you think he would save first? The thick smoke stung Veronica's eyes until tears streamed down her face. She struggled desperately, but then heard hurried footsteps outside the door. Fiona. Veronica. The moment Thomas rushed into the fire, Veronica vaguely recalled their wedding night. He held her close and said, Veronica, remember, no matter what, you are always my first choice. But the reality was, he didn't even look at her. He simply scooped up Fiona and rushed out. Thomas. Veronica reached out, only to be stopped by a collapsed beam. The scorching heat seared her skin. As she fell, it was as if she saw Thomas from that year standing backstage at the cultural troupe, smiling as he pressed a candy into her hand. Veronica. Veronica. Amid the sharp scent of disinfectant, Veronica struggled to open her eyes. Thomas sat at the edge of the bed, stubble darkening his chin, with deep shadows under his eyes. You just had a skin graft. Don't move around. He reached out to support her, but she pulled away. Skin graft? Veronica's voice was hoarse. She could hardly believe what she'd heard. Thomas frowned deeply. You set the fire and nearly killed Fiona. Now it's only a skin graft. Is it really worth getting this upset? Veronica suddenly laughed, tears streaming down her face. She said I set the fire? And just because she said that, you believe her? What else am I supposed to believe? Thomas rubbed his brow wearily. I'm her husband. If I don't believe her, then who can I trust? Husband, the word stabbed her heart like a knife. Veronica snatched the needle from the back of her hand. Then what are you doing here? Get out! The infusion bottle shattered on the ground. Thomas seized her bleeding hand. Sister-in-law, please calm down. I know you've suffered, but wait 10 more months. Wait until the baby is born. Get out! Veronica grabbed a pillow and flung it at him. I never want to see you again. The pillow struck his shoulder, light as air. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his Adam's apple bobbing a few times before he finally turned and walked away. After the door closed, Veronica noticed a box of milk candies left on the bedside table, the very kind she loved most. She seized the box and flung it hard against the wall. The milk candies spilled across the floor, like her heart shattered into fragments. Chapter 7. On the day of her discharge, the sunlight pierced so sharply that Veronica's eyes stung. Just as she reached the entrance of the residential compound for families, she saw the matchmaker on tiptoe, waving at her. Veronica, we've been waiting for you. Aunt Reyes? Veronica brushed back the stray hairs at her temple. The burn on her right arm still throbbed faintly. Captain Albert has arranged everything. The ship leaves early tomorrow morning. Aunt Reyes lowered her voice and pulled a ship ticket from her bosom. He specifically told me not to let you bring too much luggage. Everything is ready on the island. Veronica quickly took a red envelope from her pocket and handed it over. Thank you, Aunt, for making this trip. Oh, Captain Albert already gave the matchmaker's fee. This was given separately. Veronica pressed the red envelope into Aunt Reyes's hand, a faint smile lifting the corner of her mouth. Celebrate my new beginning. Aunt Reyes was momentarily stunned. Then her face broke into a radiant smile. It is indeed time to celebrate. Forget the husband who's gone. The only way forward is to look ahead. Yes. In everyone's eyes, Thomas had been dead for a long time. Dead in that mission, claimed by that bloodstained badge. Only she knew that he was very much alive, living in another woman's embrace. Just as she was about to speak, the courtyard gate was thrown open with a loud bang. Thomas stood gloomily at the doorway, his uniform drenched in sweat, clearly having rushed back in haste. I told you not to speak of matchmaking for Veronica. He snatched the red envelope from Aunt Reyes's hand. I will take care of her, and she would never agree to remarry. Aunt Reyes shuddered in fright, but she already. Aunt, please leave first, Veronica softly interrupted, giving Aunt Reyes a meaningful glance. Aunt Reyes hurriedly stepped out, only to collide headlong with Fiona entering the room. Fiona looked up and saw Thomas standing protectively in front of Veronica, her eyes instantly darkening. In the stillness of the night, Veronica was packing her bags when the door suddenly burst open. Fiona, her barely noticeable belly protruding, sneered coldly. Didn't you learn your lesson last time? Still dare to seduce Manuel? Without looking up, Veronica folded her clothes and said, I'm leaving tomorrow. You. Before she could finish, Fiona suddenly collapsed with a cry, clutching her stomach and wailing, My child! Almost simultaneously, Thomas rushed in from outside. Fiona. He didn't so much as glance at Veronica, scooped up Fiona and rushed outside. Veronica stood frozen, hearing Fiona cry out in the hallway. She pushed me. Manuel, our child. What a feeble performance. Veronica wanted to laugh, but the bitter sting of tears tasted at the corners of her mouth. At dawn, just as Veronica reached the gate carrying her suitcase, she collided with a weary and dust-covered Thomas returning in haste. Dark bruises ringed his eyes, stubble dotted his chin, and bloodshot veins clouded his gaze. Why do you keep harming Fiona? He gripped her wrist tightly. I stayed by her side all night. The baby was almost lost. Veronica pulled her hand free and walked out in silence. He finally noticed her suitcase. How did you know I was going to send you away? You even packed your bags. Veronica finally stopped. Send me away? His handsome face was marked by exhaustion. Yet he said coldly, Yes. Fiona's embryo portrait is unstable. I don't want to see you right now. You should go stay at your parents' place for a while. Without a word, he snatched the suitcase. I'll take you to the train station. No need. Veronica grabbed the suitcase back. I'll go by myself. Thomas stubbornly followed, as if afraid she wouldn't leave, escorting her all the way to the train station. Stay at your parents' house for now. When the baby is born, I'll come get you. I'm not going in with you. Buy your own ticket. Fiona's still at the hospital waiting for me. After a few reminders, he quickly turned and left. Veronica stood before the ticket window and suddenly laughed. Thomas, just devote your life to taking care of Fiona. After Veronica watched the army green Jeep vanish into the morning mist, she slowly turned and walked in the opposite direction. There was a shuttle to the harbor. Albert was waiting for her, and a brand new life awaited. In the morning light, she cast one final glance back toward the military compound. Thomas, this time, you and I will never meet again. Chapter 8. At the harbor. The moment Veronica stepped off the bus carrying her luggage, she spotted a man in a gray coat eagerly waving at her. Veronica. Albert, when he saw the person he had long admired, his previously calm eyes immediately lit up. Without a second thought for the many bags around him, he quickly hurried toward Veronica and reached out to take the luggage from her hands. Let me help you carry these. Veronica was not one to be overly sentimental. And besides, since she and Albert were to be a married couple living together for the rest of their lives, she needed to get used to him, so she handed the suitcase in her hands to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. Thank you. The woman's voice, crisp as a mountain spring, reached Albert's ear, and in that moment, like ripe tomatoes in the field, a flush of red spread across his ears. He shyly scratched his head and chuckled. No need to be so formal. After all, from now on, we're family. Family? Veronica halted, instinctively glancing up at the Albert next to her. It was the first time in years that she had truly scrutinized the man beside her. From the matchmaker's eager introductions and the gossip of her former high school classmates, one thing was unmistakable, that Albert truly liked her. Over the years, Albert's parents introduced many potential matches to him, but he rejected every one. Throughout these years, many bold women passionately courted him, but he politely turned them all down. Even in the years she was presumed widowed, he disregarded the rumors and patiently waited for her, waiting for her to give him a sign. Even now, as she looked at him, he secretly stole glances at her from the corner of his eye. Whenever their gazes met, he immediately pretended indifference and quickly averted his eyes, only his flushed cheeks gave him away. Such an amusing scene naturally drew a chuckle from her. But then Veronica seemed to recall something. This time, she called out his name first, her expression serious. "Albert, I need to tell you something." Since she had resolutely decided to abandon Thomas entirely, to forget all that had passed, and to sever all ties with former matters and people, committing herself to live well with the man before her, she needed to make corresponding promises, speaking plainly about everything that needed to be said to prevent any unnecessary misunderstandings in the future. Seeing her so serious, Albert mirrored her composure, concealing the excitement in his smile, and met her gaze with equal earnestness. "Go ahead." Veronica took a deep breath and said, "I suppose you already know about my past." Albert, how could he not? From the moment he first fell for Veronica, he had quietly kept watch over her. That was why, at the very first moment after her husband's death, he was the first to engage a matchmaker to propose, making everyone in the residential compound for families aware that she belonged solely to him. "So," Albert promptly nodded. Veronica smiled faintly. "But what I want to tell you is that my husband is not dead." Buzz. Upon hearing those words, Albert's mind went completely blank. He didn't even notice that what he was holding had fallen to the ground, while his heart surged with turbulent waves. What did she mean by saying her husband was still alive? Did this mean that his years-long hope was about to be dashed once again? He hadn't even properly expressed the deep love he had built up all those years to her. Was he about to lose her again? Just as Albert was lost in a daze, a warm, soft little hand suddenly reached out and grasped his, while a soothing voice spoke softly in his ear. "But rest assured, I will not return with him, and our marriage ended completely the moment he died. Besides, he is now the husband of the Sanchez family's eldest daughter-in-law." What? The string of explosive revelations left Albert stunned, struggling for a long time to come to terms with the shock. So Veronica revealed to the man before her everything, how Thomas Sanchez had impersonated her elder brother, slept with the eldest sister-in-law, planned to wait until the child was born before acknowledging their relationship, and all the rest. "Even if one day he comes looking for me and asks me to go with him, you need not worry, he has no evidence whatsoever that he is Thomas." Chapter 9. Come to think of it, Veronica owed a debt of gratitude to Thomas for having severed all escape routes himself. When she first heard the dreadful news of Thomas's death years ago, she completely collapsed, suffering a nervous breakdown and sometimes mistaking her already adult brother-in-law for her husband, whether to make her give up entirely or for some other reason. Thomas solemnly swore before everyone in the residential compound for families that he could only ever be Fiona's husband, and he even burned all proofs that he was Thomas, effectively consigning his dead self to the flames, claiming it was to help her fully come to terms with the fact that her husband had truly died. So there was no longer anyone or any evidence to prove that he was Thomas. If he now insisted on proving he was Thomas, he would either be declared insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital, or, if verified, imprisoned by the disciplinary committee and others on charges of fraud. Whichever path he chose, it was a death sentence, and for Veronica, this also completely cut off any future troubles. At the sound of this, Albert's heart, which had been lodged in his throat, suddenly fell back into his stomach. In his memory, Thomas was still the decisive and meticulous man. He never thought that one day Thomas would end up throwing himself under the bus for so-called love. But perhaps this is for the best. He can never take Veronica away from him again. From this moment on, Veronica will belong to him forever. At this thought, the smile he had hidden resurfaced, and even the hand held tightly by Veronica he now gripped back with equal strength. "Albert, since I have decided to marry you and live a good life, it means I am letting go of everything from the past and will not look back for anyone. But I also hope that after marrying you, You will not do anything to betray me. You know who I am. If you do, I will leave you forever and make you." Before Veronica could finish her words, Albert suddenly pulled her into his arms. The scent of soap and sunlight on him flooded her senses, bringing an inexplicable sense of calm over her. "Veronica, I have loved you for a full 10 years and waited for you all this time. I know better than anyone how hard it was for you to finally say yes. I also understand more than anyone how great the courage was that it took for you to sever the past and embrace a new love. All I can do is love you with all my strength, to warm you, not to hurt you. I know you might not entirely believe me. After all, you've only just begun to accept and understand me, and your heart won't be fully mine at once. But there are many things ahead, and I will prove how deeply I love you, from beginning to end." Albert's tone was calm yet unwaveringly resolute. It was as if a great hand had covered Veronica's cold, lifeless heart, gradually warming it, allowing the barren soil to sprout tender green shoots once more. For some inexplicable reason, Veronica's eyes reddened slightly, but she said nothing, simply reaching out to gently stroke Albert's back, slowly tightening her embrace. At that moment, the ships docked in the harbor sounded their horns, urging the passengers who had yet to board. Albert first released the person in his arms, then held both their luggage in one hand and Veronica's hand in the other, smiling at her. "Let's go, together with him, to begin a new life." "All right." Veronica also glanced back and smiled at him. They boarded the ship along with the steady flow of passengers. Another horn sounded, and black smoke poured from the funnel at the ship's bow, like an invisible giant hand waving farewell to the harbor. The passengers on the deck pressed against the railing, reluctantly waving goodbye to their loved ones on the shore. Only Veronica and Albert stood close together, silently watching the harbor grow more distant until it disappeared from sight. Chapter 10. At the hospital. Thomas hurried there without pause after seeing Veronica to the train station. Ever since Fiona was pushed down by Veronica, her pregnancy had remained unstable, and she had become increasingly delicate, utterly dependent on him. If she failed to see him even briefly, Fiona would break into sobbing fits, overwhelmed with distress until she fainted. At the thought of this, he quickened his pace. Sure enough, waking in the ward without seeing her husband, Fiona's tears immediately welled up and flowed down. "Manuel, Manuel, where are you?" When no one answered for a long while, Fiona grew more and more anxious, and the pain in her stomach intensified. But she had no time to think of these things. She dragged her weakened body, trying to get out of bed to look for him. Then, in the next moment, the man Fiona had been calling for so long suddenly opened the door from outside and strode towards her. "Fiona." Seeing the woman about to get out of bed falter and fall, Thomas's heart tightened, and he rushed forward. "Be careful." Enfolded in the familiar embrace, Fiona's long-held anguish and fear surged forth. Her grip on Thomas's shirt tightened as she slowly lifted her eyes to his. As she lifted her gaze, tears spilled down and splattered onto the floor. I thought you had abandoned me." In recent days, Thomas's strange behavior toward Veronica, and Veronica's covert provocations, awakened a growing sense of alarm in Fiona. Having witnessed her mother's family fall apart and endured more than a decade of hardship, she knows all too well what such a sense of crisis truly means. That is why Fiona is deeply afraid. Afraid that Thomas will abandon her just as Uncle Joe abandoned Aunt Jo. Over the years, Thomas has been exceptionally good to her. Not only did he pull her out of the mire but also provided a life of comfort she had never dared to imagine. Furthermore, after returning from the battlefield, he loved her with an almost frantic devotion, insisting on taking her to bed every night. He loved her so deeply that she could no longer imagine life without him. She simply couldn't bear to think about how she would survive after losing him. That was why she spared no effort to prevent this tragic end. But when she awoke in the hospital bed, she saw no sign of him. Only Thomas's guard informed her that he had gone home to send Veronica back to her parents' house. But Fiona waited for a long time. Yet he never returned. She was too fearful that something might have happened to him on the way. If something had indeed occurred, then what will become of her and the child she carries? Fortunately, he arrived just in time. Seeing the woman in his arms in such a state, Thomas held back the words he wished to speak, letting them dissolve into a sigh. He raised his hand and gently wiped away Fiona's tears with his rough fingertips. Only after calming Fiona and carrying her back to bed did Thomas explain the reason for his delay. Thomas had originally intended to send Veronica Morales directly back to the Morales family, but out of concern for Fiona, he compromised by taking her somewhere away from the train station. Then, without pause, he hurried to the hospital. Unexpectedly, the car broke down halfway, and not wanting to worry her, he left the car with the security guard and rushed on foot to the hospital. It was then that Fiona noticed the beads of sweat still glistening on his forehead and his clothes drenched with perspiration. She was both moved and distressed, quickly taking a handkerchief to wipe his face. Then, as if recalling something, she bit her lip. But, Manuel, it's not right to leave your younger brother's wife alone at the train station. I've heard there's been some unrest there recently. What if something happens? Fiona's words were filled with worry, but deep down she harshly wished that Veronica would come to harm. Now that Veronica was truly in trouble, she would never again return to entangle her husband. At these words, Thomas's body stiffened instantly, but then he shook his head and comforted Fiona in his arms. That won't happen. She's an adult now and will surely take good care of herself. Thomas recalled how, over the years without him, Veronica had managed to care for herself quite well. She was only going back to her parents' home for a short visit. What could possibly go wrong? Furthermore, he had already called Mr. Morales and Mrs. Morales, asking them to meet her at the train station. Chapter 11. That evening, Thomas, as always, lay beside Fiona, holding her close and gently caressing her belly. As soon as the child was mentioned, the two fell into a leisurely conversation. For some reason, Fiona became curious about the child's features. Manuel, who do you think the child will take after more? Thomas's hand, resting on her belly, hesitated briefly before he said, whoever it may be, as long as you're happy with it. Though that was what was said, the image of Veronica suddenly surfaced in Thomas's mind. If he and Veronica were to have a child in the future, who would the child resemble? If it were a girl, he wished the child would resemble her more, so he could cherish them both at once. If it were a boy, he hoped the child would take after him, so he could teach his son to protect her together. At the thought of their child clinging to them sweetly, Thomas's once stern face softened, and a faint smile unconsciously curved his lips. Seeing him so gentle, Fiona's body went limp, and she leaned deeper into his embrace, her frail hands slowly slipping inside his clothing. Manuel. Thomas lowered his head and saw Fiona looking at him with sultry eyes. Every gesture was filled with suggestiveness, tightening something deep within him. But Thomas knew well that his mission had been fulfilled the moment Fiona's pregnancy was announced. Now he stayed by her side only to ensure she gave birth safely. He was ready to return to his own family and would never touch his elder brother's woman again. With that thought, he took a deep breath, struggling to suppress the strange sensations in his body, and was about to pull Fiona's hand away. But Fiona, heavy with desire since becoming pregnant, would never let him go so easily. Believing he was reluctant to let go, she took the initiative to press her luscious, tempting lips against his. Manuel, we are married, and the pregnancy is secure now, so it's all right. Thud. The words married couple struck Thomas's heart like a heavy hammer, jolting him awake. Yes, all he wanted was to return quickly to the small home he shared with Veronica, but he had forgotten his current identity. He was still Manuel, still Fiona's husband. He had to continue to fulfill his duties as her husband. At that thought, his eyes darkened, and suddenly he kissed Fiona, lying face to face under the covers. He cupped her face with one hand, breath quickening, kissing her softly, then with growing intensity. His other hand rested gently on her waist, carefully shielding the child she carried within her. Fiona's gaze was distant, her smooth, pale chin slightly raised, her hands resting weakly on his shoulders, yielding to his every demand. The rain outside grew heavier, and through the glass, the relentless drumming could almost be heard. Dark clouds churned on the horizon, thunder rumbled, and a torrential downpour swept in. Dampness slipped through the poorly sealed window, bringing a penetrating chill. The ward curtains were suddenly torn shut by a large hand, leaving only a single wall lamp lit, its faint glow revealing two entwined shadows. Gently, the next morning, after a night of rain, the downpour had finally stopped. The air, fresh from the rain, was filled with the mingled scent of earth and fragrant grass. At the same time, sunlight filtered through the gaps between the branches and leaves, shining on the reclining chairs beneath the trees and the swings swaying among them. Tiny flowers, no bigger than a cup's rim, had been knocked down by the rain and scattered across the ground. After a night of silence, the streets gradually came alive again, bicycle bells ringing, vendors calling out, and the constant hum of bustling activity. The alarm-like sound also roused Thomas, who was holding Fiona tightly on the hospital bed. He carefully released the person in his arms, got out of bed, bent down to pick up the scattered clothes on the floor one by one, and then tossed them into the laundry basket. Next, he opened the wardrobe, rummaged inside for fresh clothes, changed, and quietly left. Considering the time, Veronica Morales should have arrived at her parents' home by now. Last night, due to the late hour and concerns about her exhaustion from a long car ride, they had refrained from calling the Morales family despite their worry. A night had passed, and she should have rested by now. Thinking this, he hurried to the public phone booth, picked up the receiver, and dialed the Morales family's number. Beep, beep. The call went unanswered, and Thomas's heart grew heavier. Just as he was about to hang up and redial, Mr. Morales's voice suddenly came through. "Who is this?" Thomas's eyes lit up with joy, and he spoke urgently. "Dad, Uncle Morales. It's me, I'm Manuel." Mr. Morales on the other end replied with a simple "Oh, is there something you wanted to talk about?" Chapter 12. Hearing Mr. Morales's distant tone, Thomas was momentarily taken aback. In his recollection, Mr. Morales had always been satisfied with him as a son-in-law and had welcomed his family warmly. Not as it was now. He tightened his grip on the receiver, feeling that Mr. Morales's attitude was somehow strange, though he couldn't say exactly why. On the other end, Mr. Morales was about to hang up, as Thomas's silence suggested he wasn't going to speak. Only then did Thomas come to his senses and quickly asked Mr. Morales if Veronica had returned home and was available to take the call. Mr. Morales's voice faltered. Then Mrs. Morales snatched the phone with a slightly mocking tone. "You meddle in everything, controlling Veronica's entire life. Don't you know whether she will return or not?" Thomas was stunned, then suddenly remembered why the Morales family harbored resentment toward him. After Veronica became a widow, the Morales family, fearing she would suffer alone, intended to take her back and find her a good family to marry into. But Thomas was not dead at all. How could he possibly stand by and watch his wife marry another? At that moment, he desperately stood blocking the door, refusing to let the Morales family in. He even ignored the whispers of others, kneeling before the Morales family and swearing to heaven that he would take good care of Veronica. But the Morales family simply didn't believe him. They insisted on taking Veronica away no matter what. It was only after he brought in a superior that the issue was finally resolved. From then on, the Morales family showed no goodwill toward him or the Sanchez family. Thomas Sanchez, feeling guilty, resolved that once Fiona gave birth, he would personally go to the Morales family to seek their forgiveness. After hanging up, Mrs. Morales looked at Mr. Morales with a somewhat troubled expression. How dare he come asking about Veronica? The Morales family had long known that the person on the other end of the call was Thomas. After all, they had already learned through the matchmaker about Veronica's plan to marry Albert and go to the island. They hadn't told Thomas or the Sanchez family because Thomas had deceived them first. It was simply tit for tat. Mr. Morales's expression was equally grim, but he patiently comforted his wife. "Rest assured, I will never let him off that easily." After Fiona's high-risk pregnancy was stabilized, she was brought home by Thomas Sanchez, and the day she returned coincided with the 60th birthday of Sanchez's mother. Over the years, the Sanchez family's status had risen steadily, owing to having one son who was a martyr and another who was a superior officer. On the day of the birthday banquet, the Sanchez household was thronged with guests. Even Thomas's superior officer had come specifically to visit Sanchez's mother. For a while, Sanchez's mother basked in boundless glory. She lifted her eyes and swept across the room, where all those seated were members of the Sanchez family. On the left were Thomas and her eldest daughter-in-law, Fiona. On the right were her youngest daughter and son-in-law, who had married far away in the capital and had rushed back this time by train specifically. Only the very bottom seat remained empty, the place meant for her second daughter-in-law, Veronica. Mrs. Sanchez had originally hoped to seize this chance for Thomas to bring Veronica back. Yet Thomas, using the long journey as an excuse, worried she might be exhausted and that her return could provoke trouble and harm Fiona, successfully convinced Mrs. Sanchez to abandon the idea. The Sanchez family has long struggled for an heir. And now, after so much effort, Fiona is finally expecting. Sanchez's mother also wishes to prevent any further accidents befalling Fiona. It is regrettable that the birthday banquet could not be attended by everyone. Upon hearing the knock at the door, Sanchez's mother rose quickly. "Let's go. The banquet is about to begin." Fiona hurried to her feet, intending to support Sanchez's mother, but the latter waved her off. "No need. I can walk on my own. You're heavy now. Let Manuel look after you." Fiona's cheeks flushed as she glanced at Thomas, who came to assist her. At the moment their eyes met, she quickly looked away, seeing how deeply connected the two were. Everyone around praised them endlessly. Only Sanchez's parents, who knew the truth, forced smiles upon their faces. The Sanchez family courtyard was festively decorated with lanterns and banners. Thomas had specially bought a television that was now showing an entertaining film, while on the other side, a stage performance was underway, watched intently by Mrs. Sanchez. As fireworks blossomed in the sky, the banquet finally surged to its climax. Thomas Sanchez and Fiona, supporting each other from either side, came to the table where a longevity peach cake had been specially ordered from a Western pastry shop by Fiona. Amidst the chorus of blessings, Sanchez's mother was about to take the knife to cut the cake. But in the next moment, the tightly shut door was abruptly kicked open from the outside. With a grim expression, the Morales family burst in. Manuel. The lively atmosphere immediately came to a halt. Everyone stared at the approaching Morales family in confusion. It was Thomas, however, whose expression subtly shifted when his name was called. He could not understand why the Morales family had traveled all the way to the Sanchez household. And among the Morales family members, he noticed that Veronica was missing. Confusion, bewilderment, panic, and unease, all these complex emotions instantly engulfed him completely. Just as he was about to step forward and speak, Mrs. Sanchez quickly forced a smile and reached out to take Mrs. Morales's hand. "Oh dear, in-laws, what brings you here?" Faced with Mrs. Sanchez's flattering approach, Mrs. Morales gave no sign of appreciation and brusquely pushed her away. "Don't call me your in-law." Chapter 13. Mom. Thomas hurried forward to support his mother, his face growing grim. "What are you all doing?" Mrs. Morales grew even angrier. "What are you doing? I should be the one asking what your family is planning. You swore in front of everyone to take good care of my daughter. How long has it been? And look at what you've done to her." Seeing the commotion, the crowd stopped leaving and gathered to watch. The Sanchez family, however, was startled and exchanged worried glances before hastily trying to usher the Morales family back inside. Mr. Morales lost his temper and shouted for the others to stop them. "Where do you think you're going? You only feel ashamed now. But how could you have had the nerve back then when you hurt my daughter? Manuel, I want to ask you, was it you who made my daughter take your wife's place to illegally trade quotas for sent-down youth returning to the city? Was it you who almost got my daughter killed by the collapsing coal mine? Was it you whose wife set fire in an attempt to kill my daughter and then left her to die without any rescue?" After Mr. Morales disclosed several explosive secrets one after another, the entire room was thrown into an uproar, voices rising in heated debate. Mrs. Sanchez had no idea about the truth of these matters. Her face immediately turned pale as she looked at her son in disbelief. "Manuel, is this all true?" "Of course it is." Before Thomas could speak, Mrs. Morales raised the pre-printed evidence and scattered it about. The pristine white sheets fluttered down like a heavy snowfall, landing in the hands of those nearby. As everyone read the words on the papers clearly, their expressions changed dramatically. "My God, is all of this really true? The Sanchez family is utterly ruthless to treat a widow like this. Veronica is just a widow, and yet they insist on blaming her eldest daughter-in-law? They are driving Veronica Morales to her death." At the sound of these words, Mrs. Morales's long-held grievances finally erupted. She collapsed to the ground with a thud, sobbing uncontrollably, each word soaked with pain. "How heartless you are. Your family has no conscience. My dear daughter has been destroyed by you. If you couldn't take care of my daughter, why didn't you let us take her away from the start? My poor daughter. The scene suddenly descended into chaos. Accusations, cries, and curses struck Mrs. Sanchez's face like sharp slaps. She could no longer endure it. Clutching her chest, her eyes rolling back as she fainted. Mom! Mom! Amid the chaos, Thomas's commander, an elderly political commissar from the military district, stepped forward to take charge and asked the Morales family what they intended to do. Helped to her feet by her nephew, Mrs. Morales wiped away her tears and firmly declared, I want my daughter Veronica to completely sever all ties with the Sanchez family. Boom! Suddenly, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening thunderclap, illuminating the faces in the courtyard, each marked with different emotions. Most of all Thomas, whose face drained of color in an instant, as if every drop of life had been sucked away at that moment. What had he just heard? They intended for Veronica and the Sanchez family to sever all ties completely. No, absolutely not. Fiona's child is about to be born any moment now, and then he will be able to carry out his elder brother's will. Soon he will be able to return to Veronica's side as Thomas and reveal the entire truth to her. Soon they will be able to resume their happy life together. Yet at this very moment, before his plan is complete, the Morales family is forcing Veronica, his wife, to leave him. He absolutely will not allow it. No. Regrettably, Thomas's protests were utterly powerless against the Morales family's resolute determination. Since uncovering Thomas's true identity, the Morales family has come to loathe him and the entire Sanchez family. They had believed their daughter would find happiness after marrying in, but they never imagined it would turn into a wolf's den. If they had known, they would have fought tooth and nail to prevent their daughter from marrying in. Thankfully, they were able to mend the fold after the sheep were lost and cut their losses in time. Yet, they also felt fortunate that Thomas had done what he did. This gave their daughter a reason, as a widow, to completely sever ties with the Sanchez family. This was far easier than dissolving a military marriage, and neither Thomas nor the Sanchez family had any grounds to bother their daughter anymore, unless he blows himself up. In that case, he would also be thrown into prison, no matter which path he took. For Thomas, it was a fate worse than death. The Morales family thought this through and intended to seize the occasion of Mrs. Sanchez's birthday banquet to publicly pressure him. If he dared to claim he was Thomas himself, they could kill two birds with one stone, sending both him and the entire Sanchez family to hell. Chapter 14. What right have you to oppose me? Ah, Manuel. The final word was sharply enunciated by Mrs. Morales, as if to remind Thomas of his assumed identity. If you speak of widowhood, my daughter has been a widow for nearly 2 years, mourning your brother. If you speak of hardship, she has endured so much suffering. Even if she owes you all, one might say this debt has been fully repaid. Furthermore, if anyone truly has the right to object, it should be my daughter's husband, your brother Thomas. You are merely an uncle, even an outsider, with no blood relation or ties to my daughter. What exactly do you oppose? And no, I am Thomas. Boom! Another thunderclap echoed, and the once tumultuous scene fell into complete silence. Everyone stared at Thomas in disbelief, their mouths falling open in astonishment. Did they mishear? What did he just say? Did he claim to be Thomas? This is unbelievable. Nearby, Fiona was even more shocked, so stunned she forgot the pain in her stomach. She ignored everything else and gripped Thomas's hand. Manuel, what nonsense are you spouting? Yeah, even if you want to keep your sister-in-law, you shouldn't be saying such foolish things. Aren't you afraid his brother will come looking for him at night? Exactly, Manuel. You're truly confused. Mrs. Morales gazed at the man eagerly revealing his identity and let out a cold sneer. What proof do you have that you are Thomas? Everyone witnessed Thomas's body with their own eyes, and they saw his coffin being buried. Sure, you can eat worse food, but you mustn't speak carelessly, Manuel. This kind of thing is no joke. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his hands clenched into tight fists, his brow heavy with torment and inner struggle. After a long pause, he finally raised his head, each word spoken with resolute firmness. I am Thomas, not Manuel. The one who died back then was my brother, not me. Thomas still overestimated himself. He had planned to wait until Fiona's child was born before revealing the truth, but now they are forcing his wife, Veronica. To leave him. They closed in step by step, catching him off guard and leaving him utterly helpless. He could not lose Veronica. As for Fiona, he had been with her for so many years and had given her a child. Even if he were gone, she would still be able to live on with strength. Boom! Thunder rumbled, followed by a torrential downpour. Raindrops clattered against the eaves like bullets, linking into strings that fell intermittently and struck the canopy. The roar of the rain made it hard to discern the voice of the man in the crowd. But Fiona, sitting right next to Thomas, heard every word clearly. Suddenly, her mind went utterly blank. As if struck by lightning, she shook her head in disbelief and stepped back a few paces, only to hit her knee sharply against the corner of the mahogany table. Staggering as she sank to the floor, Manuel, are you joking with me? The husband who had held her every night for 2 years, the husband who had repeatedly professed his love while embracing her, now stood among the crowd, delivering cold words that revealed the cruel truth to everyone, especially to her. He was not her husband at all, but her brother-in-law. He was the husband of the very Veronica she despised most. She trembled as she raised her eyes to the man. You're joking with me, aren't you? Fiona gazed at Thomas's face, only to see it suddenly twist and blur under the harsh light. All those questions that had long tormented her heart were finally answered at this moment. The man whose personality and passions had dramatically changed. The same man who would occasionally show concern for his widowed younger brother's wife, even driving away the suitors he introduced again and again. The man who, while gazing at her tenderly in bed, always seemed to see through her towards someone else. The man who was always the first to rush to Veronica's side whenever she was hurt. The man who drunkenly barged into Veronica's room. At last, everything found its answer in this very instant. The chandelier swayed in the storm. Fiona finally let out a broken sob, the sound growing louder, just like the anguished, desperate cries Veronica had made 2 years ago when she learned of her husband's sacrifice. The grief of losing her husband, delayed for 2 years, at last overwhelmed her today. Unable to bear the shock any longer, she finally rolled her eyes and fainted completely. Blood slowly seeped from beneath her, staining her pristine white dress little by little. Blood, so much blood. Someone's had a miscarriage. Quick, call a car. Chapter 15. The chaos was temporarily halted when Fiona fainted. After a night of desperate efforts, Fiona survived, but the child she carried was lost. Smack! Mrs. Sanchez struck Thomas sharply across the face, lamenting bitterly, "You are utterly senseless." If only Thomas Sanchez could have held on a little longer. If he had waited a few more months, Fiona's child would have been born, securing a legacy for the Sanchez family. But it was on that very day he exposed the secret, not only causing the Sanchez family to lose their grandson but also bringing utter disgrace upon them. Now the whole of South City knows that the youngest son of the Sanchez family masqueraded as his elder brother and slept with his widowed sister-in-law. There is no longer any need for the Morales family to interfere. The old political commissar has decisively severed all ties between Veronica and the Sanchez family. Furthermore, because the scandal grew so large, even Thomas's superior officer was stripped of his position, after losing so much one after another. How could Mrs. Sanchez not be enraged? She immediately tried to slap him again, but Thomas was like a lifeless puppet. No matter how Mrs. Sanchez hit or scolded him, it was all in vain. Finally, a nurse came out to stop them and asked if the patient inside had awakened, and who would go see Fiona. Only then did Thomas come to his senses, his voice hoarse as he said, "I'll go in." After all, Fiona was unaware of what had happened. It was a debt he owed her, and he would do his best to make amends. With that thought, he ignored Mrs. Sanchez's yelling behind him and pushed the door open to Fiona's ward. The moment the door closed, the noisy sounds outside were cut off. Thomas looked up toward the hospital bed and immediately saw the woman with a pale face and hollow eyes. He clenched his fists, stepped toward Fiona, and then sat down beside her hospital bed. "This is my fault. Whatever compensation you want, just say the word." Compensation? After a long while, Fiona on the hospital bed finally responded. She slowly turned her head to look at him, staring at this man whose eyes were bloodshot, chin covered in stubble, and whose entire demeanor was one of utter desolation. Her eyes filled with complex emotions. How could he possibly make amends to himself? She longed for her husband's return day and night, shared intimate moments with him without respite, and at last, joyfully became pregnant with a child bearing both their bloodlines. Everything was so perfect. Yet he abruptly shattered her dreams, telling her it was all to spare her from the anguish of widowhood, a carefully crafted lie meant to sustain her through the child. Now, with the lie unveiled, her husband is gone, the child is lost, and her reputation lies in ruins. Now that she has lost everything, how else could he possibly make amends to her? Fiona's fingers clenched the quilt so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sound that forced its way from her throat felt as if it had been raw from sandpaper. Thomas, your foremost responsibility isn't to make amends to me, but to preserve this lie, so she could continue to lose herself in beautiful dreams, to carry on living. Instead of enduring that agonizing pain again and again, Thomas closed his eyes, his voice growing ever weaker. In that moment, every word he wanted to say felt pale and powerless. The ticking of the wall clock echoed softly. In the ward, only the sound of 2 breaths could be heard. After a long silence, Fiona finally spoke again. Any compensation will do? Thomas hesitated, then answered, yes. This time, Fiona smiled at last, though the warmth never reached her eyes. Then fine. I want you to marry me. Bang! Thomas stood up abruptly from his chair. No. The only woman he loved was Veronica. She alone was his wife, and he would never marry anyone else. This is absurd. Pick another one. Absurd? Fiona suddenly laughed, though her voice was thick with sarcasm. You think this is absurd? Then why didn't it seem absurd when you arrogantly impersonated your brother to sleep with me and have a child? Do you realize that because of you, my reputation is utterly ruined? I will never marry again. How am I supposed to live from now on? I'm telling you, Thomas, you can only, and must, marry me in this lifetime. Chapter 16. No, certainly. Thomas had not finished speaking when Sanchez's mother, who had been eavesdropping by the ward door, suddenly interrupted and stormed in. Sanchez's mother was already deeply distressed over losing one son and daughter-in-law. Now, facing the loss of a second daughter-in-law, she was so anxious that her lips had started to foam. Unexpectedly, Fiona took the initiative to propose marriage to Thomas, which was incredibly good news for Sanchez's mother. Mom! Thomas could never have imagined that at such a moment, Sanchez's mother would still come out to stir up trouble. Thomas, our family has already failed Veronica. We must not fail Fiona as well. I have agreed to this. Once Fiona is discharged, you two should go register your marriage. Impossible, my wife is only Veronica. Thomas's face fell completely. He had already hurt Veronica once, and he could not bring himself to hurt her again, nor could he marry another. No matter what you think, I want only Veronica. Thomas. Bang! At that moment, the ward door was suddenly flung open from outside, and a breathless figure entered. Thomas, there's news about Veronica. Really? In an instant, Thomas's previously sullen expression brightened with joy, and without hesitation, he hurriedly rushed out. Thomas, stop right there. No matter how loudly Sanchez's mother shouted from behind, Thomas never once looked back. Somewhere on an island in the south, Veronica had underestimated her own physical stamina. During the 3-day voyage, she suffered seasickness for 2 days, and on the 3rd day, she was drowsy and slept deeply. From the moment she disembarked to Albert's residence, she was carried on Albert's back the entire way. After lying in bed for nearly half a month, Veronica finally recovered enough strength to carefully survey her new home with Albert. The new house sat halfway up the mountainside, a 2-story building tiled inside and out, filled with the appropriate furniture and appliances. Fruit trees and vegetables were planted all around the front and back of the house. Next to the fish pond was a fenced area housing chickens, ducks, and geese. By the fish pond, Albert, wearing short sleeves and shorts, sat comfortably on a small stool, quietly fishing. When he saw Veronica approaching, he quickly fetched a new small stool for her to sit on. How are you feeling? He asked, perhaps due to the change in environment these past few days. Veronica not only lost her appetite but also lost a great deal of weight. Seeing this, Albert was deeply distressed. Every day he asked around for advice and tried various ways to prepare meals for her. Now, She finally had the strength to come downstairs and keep him company. Veronica nodded and leaned against him as she sat down. Much better. Albert's anxiety, which he had carried these past days, finally eased. He held Veronica's hand, gently massaging it. His eyes filled with regret. Had I known earlier, I would never have chosen to be stationed on this island. Albert was a foreign correspondent for the National News Department, constantly on the move abroad. This time, he chose to be stationed in the southern part of his homeland, always ready to deliver the latest news to his superiors. Another reason he chose to be stationed on the island was that Veronica had not yet accepted him. At that time, Albert thought that if she refused him, he would go to the place farthest from her so that he would no longer see her and would not lose control and try to take her away. Unexpectedly, just as he had signed his name on the list of overseas assignments, the matchmaker informed him that Veronica had agreed to marry him. Among life's three great joys, he instantly experienced two, but just as he was once filled with joy, now he was equally burdened with regret. He had never expected Veronica would struggle to acclimate after arriving on the island. Veronica clasped his hand once more and smiled. It's nothing. I must learn to adapt. Moreover, coming to the island to be stationed here is your dream. So as your fiancé, I will wholeheartedly support your ambition. Mentioning fiancé, Albert pulled her into his embrace and said, now that you mention it, we should begin preparations for our wedding. Because the island they were on was so remote and difficult for outsiders to reach, and with both sets of parents in poor health, neither family attended their wedding, yet they still sent generous dowries and bride prices. At the mention of the wedding, Veronica blushed deeply and asked him deliberately, why did you suddenly bring up the wedding? Albert smiled softly and gently kissed her forehead, his eyes burning with passionate love. Because I want to take you home immediately and make you my wife. Chapter 17. This was Albert's most deeply cherished wish for 25 years. From the moment he first saw Veronica in high school, his heart could hold no one else. Unfortunately, at that time, Veronica was wholly devoted to her studies and paid no heed to romance. Every love letter she received was met with a harsh refusal. He felt both fortunate and sorrowful. He was glad she had no one she liked, yet saddened because he feared he stood little chance of winning her. But after careful consideration, Albert resolved to muster the courage to confess his feelings to Veronica. Unfortunately, before he could confess, the two parted ways to attend universities in different cities due to the college entrance examination. By the time Albert inquired about Veronica again, she had already married Thomas. That night, empty wine bottles were scattered at Albert's feet, yet he still refused to give up on her. He continued to wait, waiting for the right opportunity. In the end, he waited until Veronica was widowed. Upon hearing this news, Albert was overjoyed, as if he wanted to set off a string of firecrackers right then and there. He didn't even have time to tell his parents. He hurriedly arranged for someone to bring the matchmaker to propose marriage on his behalf. Although Veronica had rejected him many times during this period, a good outcome finally arrived in the end. With that thought, he clutched the person in his arms even more tightly. Early the next morning, Albert and Veronica got into the car and drove along the newly constructed road toward the distant harbor. Because the island was so remote, many supplies had to be delivered by cruise ship, and due to the long journey, the cruise ship could only come once a month. Thus, the 15th of each month was the day for islanders to visit the cruise ship market. Albert held Veronica close to protect her from being jostled by others, while carefully helping her board the cruise ship. Since visits to the island were so infrequent, the cruise ship was exceptionally well stocked, truly offering everything one could desire. Not long after boarding the cruise ship, Albert had already purchased a great many things. Items such as malted milk, osmanthus oil, dresses, and butterfly brand watches, almost all were for Veronica. Seeing Albert spend so freely, Veronica felt deeply troubled and hurriedly grasped his hand. Albert, that's enough. It's really far too much. Albert smiled gently, holding her hand, but I still don't think it's enough. From the moment I fell in love with you, I started saving money, all to ensure you live well, never lacking anything, never having to envy others. Besides, if I don't spend my money on you, who else would it be for? Moreover, my family is wealthy themselves. They send us money every year. Seeing his determination, Veronica said no more and took the initiative to buy him several outfits and a bicycle to make his travel easier. So much so that by the time they left, the pickup truck was almost bursting with their belongings. In the end, they secured some large items to the roof of the car before returning home. A few days later, Veronica and Albert brought gifts and visited the well-known marriage officiant on the island, requesting him to choose an auspicious date for their wedding. Soon after the officiant's calculations, the wedding date was set for 1 month later. Once the wedding date was confirmed, the two began busily preparing for the ceremony. The first step was to obtain a marriage recommendation letter from the appropriate authorities. As they both wrote the words willing to marry several times on the letter, an unexpected wave of happiness arose. This also signified that they had taken a major step toward becoming a married couple. After receiving the marriage introduction letter, the two hurried without delay to the Civil Affairs Bureau. When signing the marriage agreement, both were filled with deep emotion. Veronica gazed at the 4 bold characters of the marriage agreement beneath her pen, inexplicably recalling the day many years ago when she and Thomas had registered their marriage. Chapter 18. At that time, she had never been in love and was just entering society. She had no experience with marriage and depended entirely on the guidance of the staff and Thomas. So much so that when she received the certificate, she felt no joy, only a deep uncertainty about the future. What she was to do next, and what role she would play, she knew nothing at all. But Thomas thought she was merely nervous and comforted her, telling her not to worry or be afraid, for he would take care of everything from then on. Later, he proved his promises true. From their wedding night to managing relations with her mother-in-law, he was always there to support her. Perhaps because he treated her so well, she became excessively reliant on him. So when she heard the news of Thomas's death, all that remained beyond her grief was a silence weighed down by secrets. She had grown so used to his care in every regard. Without him, she wondered how she could possibly go on. At that time, Thomas was, quite simply, her whole world. That was why, in that moment, she couldn't make sense of it and was driven to the brink of despair. Yet it was precisely because of Thomas's death that she gradually grew stronger and more self-reliant, realizing she could live and endure hardships on her own. But just as Veronica learned to face the hardships she had never known, she suddenly uncovered Thomas's secret. When she uncovered Thomas's secret, it felt as if she had been struck by a bolt of lightning. That was why she had completely given up on Thomas. To truly leave him behind, she agreed to Albert's proposal. Although after marrying Albert she would forget the past and do her best to fulfill her duties as a wife, it was nearly impossible for her to feel hope or passion for marriage again. But at this moment, Veronica realized she had been mistaken. Perhaps influenced by Albert's presence over these past days, she now found herself stirred with excitement and began to look forward to her future married life. She even began to imagine what she and he would do together in the future. At this thought, Veronica curled the corner of her mouth into a happy smile, lowered her head, wrote her name on the marriage agreement, and pressed her fingerprint. Albert was equally thrilled. Gazing at the marriage agreement before him, he felt as if he were dreaming. To confirm it was real, he pinched his thigh hard. At the sudden pain, he broke into a foolish smile. That laughter drew Veronica's gaze over. "What's wrong with you?" Albert gave her a silly smile as well. "It's nothing. I thought I was still dreaming, so I pinched myself." Pfft. The man's gesture made Veronica burst out laughing at once. Soon, guided by the staff, the two sat before the red cloth to have their wedding photograph taken. All right. Come on. Please bring your heads a little closer together." Following the photographer's directions, Veronica and Albert nestled close, cheek to cheek, smiling together at the camera. Albert's warm breath brushed against Veronica's face, drawing a soft blush across her cheeks. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her skirt. Too shy to meet his eyes, she looked away. So close were they that Albert could clearly hear Veronica's hammering heartbeat beside him. The pounding unsettled him, forcing him to straighten his back. Sweat broke out on him, and his hand clenched into a fist inside his pocket. He tried to steady himself, but his heart raced wildly like a frightened fawn. "All right. Look at the camera." Click! A flash of white light flickered, and the freshly printed wedding photograph was then affixed to their marriage certificate, stamped with the seal of the Civil Affairs Bureau. The newlywed couple, Veronica and Albert, accepted their marriage certificate from the staff with gratitude. while handing over the carefully prepared wedding candy. Albert held the pristine marriage certificate, his fingers gently tracing the photograph of the two of them, as if the spot where his fingers met the paper was coated with sweet candy. The scent of sweetness filled his nostrils, evoking joy throughout his entire being. The word married couple gradually took the form of a large character of joy on Albert's retina. The ID number transformed into countless fireworks reflected in his iris. He seemed to hear the whole world cheering and celebrating his successful marriage. Like a rose climbing the wall, the official seal bloomed beneath his unconsciously stroking fingertips, while the coarse texture of the household registration book's paper grazed against his skin. His skin shivered in waves, his heartbeat racing wildly with excitement. Finally, his fingertip came to rest on the date stamped at the bottom, April 20th. This was the day he and Veronica were married, the beginning of his life filled with happiness. At last, he had finally won the heart of his beloved. He drew a deep breath, striving to hold back the flood of emotions rising within him. Yet the tears at the corner of his eye revealed his inner excitement and joy. Chapter 19. But his excitement surged like a spring bursting forth, impossible to restrain. Albert could no longer hold back. He swept up the nearby Veronica and spun her around in ecstatic delight. "I'm married. I have a wife now." "Aw, what are you doing?" Suddenly lifted up, Veronica let out a startled cry. Albert, holding her, spun too fast, scaring her into quickly reaching out to clasp his neck, shyly tapping his shoulder. "I'm so happy, Veronica. I've finally married you. You're finally my wife." The more he spoke, the more excited he became, drawing the attention of those around them. Upon hearing Albert's words, several newlywed couples passing by also laughed along, their eyes filled with blessings. Veronica lowered her eyes to look at him, only to find those eyes reflecting her silhouette, filled with an intense, uncontainable love. Her heart pounded wildly, her cheeks involuntarily flushed. She bowed her head slightly, a gentle smile spreading across her face. She felt truly fortunate to be blessed once more by fate, to marry a man who loved her dearly. As night fell, the earth was bathed in moonlight, and the stars twinkled like scattered sparks across the vast sky, casting a faint yet enchanting glow. The September evening breeze rustled through the branches, and some flowers, late to bloom, quietly blossomed. Tonight was their wedding night. Veronica had already prepared herself and lay in bed early, while Albert was unusually nervous. He sat on the edge of the bed, unable to meet her gaze. At last, he took several deep breaths, as if steeling himself for a weighty decision, and turned to look at her. "Jean, Veronica, maybe we should wait until the wedding day after all." After the initial joy of receiving the marriage certificate faded, Albert had calmed down but remained extremely anxious, mingled with a trace of fear. He feared that it was all just a dream, but in the next instant, a pair of soft, limber hands wrapped around his neck, and a floral scent rose with Veronica's proximity, enveloping him completely. "But Albert, we are already married, and I told you that my heart belongs only to you, that I will love only you and belong to you alone. Don't you want to have me?" Albert gazed at her in stunned silence, watching her seduce him. Then his eyes darkened swiftly. With a sudden movement, he flipped over and pinned her beneath him. "Of course, I want to have you." Albert held Veronica with one hand, their fingers interlaced tightly above her head, his lips softly kissing the corner of her mouth. Her black hair spilled like a river across the pillow, set against the soft, white fabric, creating a stark contrast. Her free hand gripped the bedsheet fiercely, the bent knuckles of her fingers exquisite in their form. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, leaving only a single wall lamp lit. Its dim, yellow glow diffused throughout the bedroom, faintly revealing two figures entwined in an intimate embrace. A night of passionate love until dawn. After crossing the final barrier, Veronica's bond with Albert grew ever closer. At dawn, he would gently place a kiss on her forehead. At dusk, returning from work, he would bring her a fresh wildflower picked from the roadside. And when seeing him off, she would embrace him while slipping a few candies and a boiled egg into his pocket, reminding him to eat if he got hungry. At night, she would leave the living room light on, keep his meal warm on the stove, then sit knitting while watching her phone, waiting for him to return. In their free time, he would also ride his bicycle with her along the coastal highway, occasionally stopping by the shore to savor the sea breeze and gather seashells. At last, as time progressed, they celebrated their wedding day. Since Veronica and Albert had long been living together, and both preferred simplicity, the wedding was kept modest and straightforward. On the wedding day, amid the crackle of firecrackers, Albert rode a Yongjo brand bicycle adorned with red ribbons and a red cloth covering the rear seat, carrying Veronica veiled beneath a red bridal cover as they followed the prescribed route. The road on both sides was lined with onlookers. Amid the chorus of blessings, wedding candies, full of their love, were thrown from the hands of the best man and bridesmaids, scattering across the sky. At last, surrounded by the crowd, Albert, having parked his bicycle, lifted the bride from the back seat and stepped across the fire basin toward the main hall. Fireworks blossomed again in midair, while from afar, the harbor resounded with the horns of arriving ships. Chapter 20. Passengers streamed down from the deck in waves, flowing like a river onto the harbor. During this time, Thomas was desperately searching thousands of miles for his wife. After learning that Veronica had neither returned to her parents' home nor been seen, Thomas roamed frantically in search of her. At last, a month later, he discovered a trace of Veronica and learned that she had come to the island. Overcome with excitement, he immediately set out to buy a ship ticket to the island to find her. However, the staff informed him that, due to the island's special status, he needed to pass through multiple layers of approval before arriving here. And, combined with the difficulty of obtaining a ship ticket, it was only today that he finally managed to set foot on the island. But only after Thomas arrived on the island did he realize how vast it was. Moreover, he had no idea where Veronica had gone after arriving. Finding her was as difficult as climbing to the heavens. Yet, the word give up had never been part of Thomas's vocabulary. Determined, he resolved to ask the islanders about Veronica while pursuing every useful lead to find her. With this in mind, Thomas quickened his pace, heading toward the distant town. As Thomas followed the bus up the mountain, he noticed it suddenly halt. The passengers immediately poured out, excitedly rushing toward a nearby place where a celebration was taking place. Thomas at first, he didn't intend to get out of the car, but a kind passerby pulled him down. "Hey, why are you just sitting there like that? Hurry up and grab some wedding candy to share in the celebration." Thomas, before he could react, the passerby dragged him into the crowd. Waves of wedding candy fell to the ground, while the wedding inside the distant house reached its climax. The groom was to lift the bride's red veil and kiss her amid the crowd's blessings. Amid the crowd's cheers, the groom gently helped the bride turn around to face him. The crowd, curious, surged forward, and among them, Thomas was pushed to the front. He gradually made out the bride's face. What first caught Thomas's eye was the bride's elegant red gown, its hem flowing like water, tracing the curve of her slender waist. For some reason, Thomas found the bride's figure eerily familiar. Then the groom before him slowly raised his hand and lifted the bride's veil. The first thing to catch everyone's eye was the bride's slender neck and the high chignon of her hair, along with the shimmering pearl earrings that adorned her ears. At last, before everyone appeared the bride's exquisitely delicate, portrait-like face. Boom! When Veronica's face appeared before Thomas, he heard thunder crashing in his ears, and his mind went completely blank. That was her, Veronica, the one he had yearned for day and night, the one he had frantically searched for all this time. In an instant, countless images flashed through Veronica's mind, the boundless love she once showed him, the times she knelt before his coffin, crying and willing to die alongside him, his endless nights of remorse and pain. And now, here he was, alive, standing right before her. When Veronica disappeared, he was truly driven to the brink of madness. He knelt countless times before the Morales family's gate, was met repeatedly with cold disdain from the Morales relatives, and was slapped by Sanchez's mother who tried to pull him away. Yet he remained unmoved like an unyielding mountain. He begged desperately, not for their forgiveness, but only for them to tell him where Veronica had gone. But until he collapsed from a high fever in the rain, the Morales family's door had never once opened. Yet Thomas refused to give up. In the end, he cast aside all pride and even begged his old rival, pleading for help to find Veronica. But now, he had finally found Veronica. What he never expected was that his Veronica had become another man's bride. Why? Why did things turn out this way? From the Morales family's reaction, He already knew that Veronica Morales had long been aware of his secret, which is why she had left in anger. But they had been married for so long. She loved him so deeply, why then would she suddenly marry another man? Had he pushed things too far himself, causing her to act out in defiance like this? Now, Thomas's mind was plunged into utter chaos, unable to hear or see anything clearly. Chapter 21. As the man was about to press his lips to Veronica's lush, inviting mouth, Thomas could no longer contain himself. Struggling desperately to break free from the crowded throng, he summoned every ounce of strength to rush toward her, paying no heed to the astonished eyes of the surrounding guests. "No, don't!" But his voice had barely escaped when it was immediately drowned out by the surrounding clamor. Thomas grew increasingly terrified, his voice turning hoarse. Only one thought raged violently in his mind: he must not let that man get close to her. They cannot marry. She is his alone. No matter the cost, he was willing to pay it all. He would fight to win Veronica back. He longed to tell her how deeply he missed her during the days she was gone. He wanted to tell her the truth of everything, that it was all over, that he could return to her side, that they could resume their lives together. He wanted to promise her that from now on he would protect her, never letting her suffer harm again. However, just as Thomas was about to break through the crowd, two men clad in green military uniforms suddenly stepped in front of him. "Sorry, you are not allowed to enter." One of the soldiers reached out his hand, his tone polite yet firm. Thomas ignored him completely, trying to push away the soldier's hand, his voice thick with suppressed urgency. "Step aside. I need to see Veronica. She is my wife." The two soldiers froze for a moment, then silently exchanged a glance, confusion evident in their eyes. Veronica is his wife? But not long ago, their young master had told them that Veronica was their young mistress, and the young mistress's former husband had long ago perished on a mission. Even if someone invented relations, they wouldn't name someone who's dead, right? One of the bodyguards immediately turned back toward the Thomas before him, his tone laced with warning. "Sorry, you still can't enter. If you cause any more trouble, we will have to ask you to leave." Thomas's face darkened immediately. Never before had he been rejected so persistently and so completely. Had this been in the past, he would have lost his temper long ago. But now, this was neither the Sanchez household nor South City. He had to endure no matter what. With that thought, Thomas clenched his fists and took a deep breath. "I really know Veronica. Could you make an exception and just tell her? Just say that Thomas wants to see her." By the end, Thomas's voice was laced with an unmistakable humility and earnest plea. Yet the two soldiers remained motionless, like a cold wall, completely blocking his way to the gate leading to Veronica. The disturbance here began to draw the attention of the surrounding guests, and whispers soon spread among them. Some had already recognized Thomas, since the scandal of Sanchez's younger son pretending to be his elder brother with his sister-in-law had caused quite a stir. It even made the front pages of many newspapers, not to mention the television news, to the extent that the residents of this island were all aware of it. Although Veronica had not stayed long on this island, it was enough time for them to understand her character. At the thought of such a kind and considerate young woman being mistreated by Thomas, the kind-hearted islanders instantly grew angry and fervently spoke up in her defense. How can someone like this even have the nerve to seek out Comrade Morales? "If I were you, I'd just hang myself right now." What terrible luck, such a joyous occasion overshadowed by this kind of person. Ugh. The more they spoke, the angrier they became, until finally someone lost control and threw a punch. Bang! A sudden gust of wind crashed toward Thomas, and before he could react, someone punched him hard in the face. Thud! Had he been the Thomas of old, he would have easily dodged the blow. But now, drained by everything and the search for Veronica, his body was broken and he lacked the strength he once had. Caught completely off guard, Thomas was instantly knocked to the ground. Before he could even draw a breath, the crowd surged forward, raining down punches and kicks. Beneath the relentless assault, Thomas could almost hear the crack of his bones breaking. Only after the attackers had vented their rage did they finally release him. Thomas lay sprawled on the ground, drenched in blood, utterly still. After a long pause, he painfully raised his hand to wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth. Not wanting to disturb the wedding inside, several strong men stepped out from the crowd, dragging Thomas as they prepared to throw him out. Get lost. Get lost. Go far away. Don't bother Comrade Morales again. If you come back, we'll beat you every time we see you. Get out. Chapter 22. Another heavy rain fell over the island tonight. Boom! A clap of thunder, streaked with lightning, ripped across the sky, the tremendous sound causing the glass windows to shake several times. Albert drew Veronica into his arms, shielding her ears with his hands. Only after the person in his embrace had once again fallen into a deep sleep did he gently release her, turn over in bed, don his coat, and step outside. The moment he stepped out the door holding the umbrella, he noticed a figure standing in the rain not far away. Albert furrowed his brow slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected that. At such a late hour, Thomas still hadn't left. After today's wedding, 2 bodyguards of Albert's father approached him privately, saying that someone claiming to be Veronica's husband was demanding to see her. Albert immediately suspected it was Thomas. According to Veronica, even if Thomas were to come looking for someone, it would have been months from now. His arrival at this moment could only mean something had gone wrong with the Sanchez family, forcing Thomas to take drastic action. Albert didn't pay much attention at first. Veronica would never look back for someone like that. If Thomas had any sense, he would quietly disappear from their sight. But no one expected Thomas to stand at their doorstep for so long. Now that Veronica had just discovered she was pregnant, he didn't want her to be disturbed by such trivial matters. With that thought, he quickened his pace toward the man standing in the rain. Outside Albert's residence, Thomas stood motionless in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone. His slightly long, wet hair clung to his cheeks. The cold wrapped around him like a shroud down his back, making him tremble uncontrollably. But Thomas seemed numb, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on the tightly closed iron door ahead. A whole day, an entire day, since the wedding ended, he had been waiting outside Albert's residence. He just wanted to ask Veronica why. Why had she suddenly left him without any warning? Why had she suddenly married someone else? He had clearly said that once Fiona's child was born, he would return to her and begin their life anew. Why couldn't she wait a little longer for him? Just as Thomas's mind swirled in confusion, the iron door, tightly shut, was opened from inside, and a figure holding an umbrella slowly approached him. At once, Thomas's hollow eyes suddenly lit up. She could not wait for the figure to come closer and hurriedly stepped forward to meet them. Veronica. But when the large black umbrella was moved aside, it revealed the face of a stranger. Click! Once again, a flash of lightning tore across the sky, momentarily illuminating the dark heavens. And this time Thomas finally saw clearly the man who had stolen his Veronica. It's you! In that moment, Thomas finally realized exactly who the man before him was. Long ago, shortly after the news of his sacrifice first spread, a matchmaker came to Veronica with a proposal. One particular matchmaker came back 7 times in a row. No matter how he tried to drive her away, it was useless, because through the matchmaker, he had also seen Albert's name and face. No, that's not right. Before meeting this matchmaker, he had in fact briefly met Albert once. That day, he had followed the political commissar to visit Elderhe at Albert's residence. The man had hurriedly come down the stairs, nodded and greeted them, then quickly left through the door. Though it was only a glance, Thomas could still sense an inexplicable hostility from Albert. At the time, he did not understand it. But now, the truth suddenly dawned on him. It turned out that Albert had been secretly watching his wife all along. You're asking for death. Chapter 23. A surge of anger rose within Thomas as he swung his fist, ready to strike Albert. Albert swiftly sidestepped Thomas's punch and immediately struck him in the face. Bang! Unlike the affectionate and gentle demeanor he showed before Veronica, Albert was now cold and composed, his brows tightly furrowed and his dark eyes narrowed with menace. Since Thomas treated him that way, he no longer felt obliged to be polite to him. The black umbrella struck the mud, splashing dirt and water all around. Lightning continuously streaked across the sky. The two fought like madmen, exchanging punches wildly, though almost all the blows were Albert hitting Thomas. After only a few blows, Thomas's face was stained with blood. He leaned pale and weary against the door, the white lightning illuminating his exhausted features again and again. The bloodstains beside him had been washed away by the rain. He tried to lift himself up but couldn't move an inch. Sharp pain coursed through every nerve in his body. Albert finally withdrew his fist, slowly wiping the blood from his hand with the handkerchief in his pocket before picking up the black umbrella he had dropped on the ground, wiping off the mud, and opening it again. Thomas, don't come here anymore. Veronica is just pregnant. The embryo portrait is unstable, so there's no way she can see you. If you insist on seeing her, I can only call the Sanchez family and ask how they raised their son. Pregnant? Thomas, who had been looking down at the ground, suddenly raised his head sharply. What did you just say? Who's pregnant? Whose child is it? Albert snorted coldly. Of course, it's mine. That sentence felt like an invisible giant hand suddenly tearing open Thomas's chest. A chilling wind surged in, freezing him stiff from head to toe. He saw nothing, heard nothing, and even his once wildly pounding heart abruptly stopped. He stood there stunned, yet inside, his emotions churned like a storm. Before coming to this island, before all these secrets were revealed, he had planned that once he returned to Veronica's side, they would have more children, so she wouldn't have to carry her resentment toward Fiona. But now, his gaze was fixed unblinkingly on Albert standing before him moments ago. He had told himself, word by word, that Veronica was pregnant, and it was his child. In an instant, Thomas felt as though his heart had been shattered into pieces, crushed and mangled beyond recognition. His breathing grew rapid and labored, his chest rising and falling violently, as if each breath was accompanied by a tearing pain. From Veronica's sudden, unannounced disappearance to now seeing her marry and bear children with another man, all these signs told him that Veronica truly no longer wanted him. The lies he had woven for himself were finally shattered completely in this moment. Suddenly, he recalled that on their wedding night, Veronica had said to him with utmost seriousness that if he ever betrayed her, she would leave him forever. At the time, he had overestimated her love for him, so he had dismissed her vow as a mere joke. That was why he kept deceiving himself repeatedly that his affair with Fiona had a reason, that he was doing it for his elder brother, to ensure his brother's widow would survive, and to secure an heir for the Sanchez family. He only sacrificed their small family for the sake of everyone, and once everything is over, he will tell Veronica the whole truth. Veronica is so understanding. She will surely understand and support him, but now everyone is telling him he is wrong, downright wrong. Heh. A bitter chuckle slipped from Thomas's lips, quickly swallowed by the roar of the heavy rain. Across from him, Albert, unwilling to waste time on such a person, turned away without hesitation and went back inside. The cold iron door slammed shut behind Thomas, and he collapsed completely to the ground, his face pressed tightly against the icy floor, tears blending with the rain. His shoulders shook violently as a long-suppressed sob escaped him, a sound so faint in the downpour, yet laden with endless sorrow and despair. Veronica. Chapter 24. Inside Albert's residence, the house remained warm as spring, unaffected by the biting cold outside. Albert had just changed his clothes and opened the door when he saw his wife sitting up on the bed, rubbing her eyes and sleepily asking where he had just been. Albert's steps faltered, recalling the recent scene. His eyes darkened briefly. Then he casually stepped forward, embraced her, and kissed her. I didn't go anywhere. Just went to the harbor to buy some food for you. Upon hearing this, Veronica suddenly widened her eyes and looked outside. With such heavy rain, what if you catch a cold? Don't worry. I'm perfectly fine. Besides, if our child wants to eat, as a father, I have to fulfill that. As he spoke, he raised his hand again to gently touch Veronica's belly. His eyes filled with tenderness. Whenever the subject of children arose, Veronica would raise her hand to cover his large one. Her eyes filled with tenderness as they rested on her belly. She had never imagined she would one day become a mother. Initially, the devastating news of Thomas's sacrifice had taken a toll on her health, coupled with the tumultuous events that followed. The doctors had said it would be difficult for her to conceive, yet against all odds, she had conceived. With this precious child, Veronica revered the gift, rarely concerning herself with outside matters. Whatever Albert said, she accepted without question and refrained from asking further. Albert had deliberately kept the fact that Thomas had come to the island to see Veronica tightly under wraps. Precisely because he valued this about her. He no longer wanted his wife to suffer grief over such a man. After dinner, Albert stayed by Veronica's side until she fell into a deep sleep before heading downstairs. Because Veronica was pregnant, both Albert's residence and the Morales family had hired many people specifically to care for her. As he came downstairs, the nanny who had been standing by the window approached to greet him. "Sir." Albert nodded. "Still there?" The nanny quickly replied. "He's been standing there for another whole night." "Humph." Albert scoffed. "Don't worry about him anymore. Whatever happens to him is none of our concern." After speaking, he reminded the nanny, "Veronica has been experiencing some pregnancy discomfort recently. Prepare the meals lightly. Nothing too greasy. Last time, the Morales family sent salted meat. Stew that with bamboo shoots for the soup." "Understood, sir." After the servants left, Albert walked to the landline and made a call. "Hello. Please transfer the call to Sanchez's residence." "Thank you." Although Albert no longer paid attention to Thomas Sanchez, Veronica could not remain shut away at home forever. She would inevitably need to go out to clear her mind and work. So, to prevent Thomas from disturbing her again, he still called Sanchez's residence, asking them to take Thomas away, at most a month, or else I will have to arrange for Thomas to be invited back. When he said this, a flicker of cruelty flashed in Albert's eyes. It was another rainy night, and Thomas had long since lost count of how many days he had been standing outside Albert's residence. He could feel clearly that his body was about to give out. Yet he still had not seen Veronica. Soon, the rain grew heavier, and one by one, the lights in Albert's residence went out. As the final light was extinguished, the light in Thomas's eyes faded completely. He knew that today would be yet another empty vigil. His heart suddenly felt hollowed out, leaving only endless despair and coldness. Albert's words echoed again in his ears at this moment, but he simply could not accept it. He and Veronica had once loved each other so deeply. She had even tried to die with him when he was presumed dead. Yet now, she would not even see him once. Humph. A bitter smile tugged at the corner of Thomas's lips. He lifted his gaze toward the pitch-black sky. The rain fell upon his face, as if even heaven was mocking him. With a heavy thud, unable to bear it any longer, his vision blackened abruptly, and he collapsed to the ground. The relentless rain continued to fall mercilessly, as if intent on drowning both him and her entirely in this cold, unforgiving world. In a haze, he thought he heard someone calling out to him urgently. Thomas. Chapter 25. In a hospital ward, Thomas, burning with fever and unconscious, had a dream. In the dream was Veronica, whom he had not seen for a long time. She was still curled up in his arms as she used to be, sweetly calling his name. But just as he leaned down to kiss her, Veronica suddenly changed her expression, sharply pushed him away, and ran into another man's arms. No matter how desperately he begged, she no longer responded to him. "Thomas, you were the one who betrayed me first, so I don't want you anymore." She left with such finality, not once looking back. "And no, don't go." Thomas suddenly opened his eyes wide, roaring as he frantically searched around with his hands. Then his palm brushed something soft. Still not fully awake, he thought it was Veronica. Immediately, joy brightened his face. He hurriedly pulled her into his arms, kissing and pleading, "Don't go. Don't leave me. I beg you, Fiona." After days at sea to reach here, never imagined their reunion with Thomas would be under such grim circumstances. At first, Fiona could hardly believe that the man she had shared her bed with for nearly 2 years was not her husband, but his younger brother. It felt as if her entire world was falling apart. A widow involved in an incestuous relationship with her late husband's younger brother, whether by choice or by force. She would be overwhelmed by the contempt of others and might even be sent by the authorities to a labor camp for correction. Fiona had fought hard to escape the living hell of her family and enjoy a better life. If she were forced to return to that past, she might as well have died. This was her thought and plan. She had already lost all dignity. Her family had rejected her, and Thomas no longer wanted her. What meaning was there left in her living? But just as Fiona was about to take her own life, Sanchez's mother suddenly appeared and desperately stopped her. She said the Sanchez family had already wronged her enough. If they drove her to death again, the Sanchez family would lose all face. Therefore, Sanchez's mother took the initiative and decided Thomas should marry her. But Thomas's opposition was so vehement that, to break their spirits, he even went to the island to find Veronica and persuade her to return. Sanchez's mother refused to give up. She bought Fiona a ship ticket to the island and arranged the necessary documents, telling her that as long as she brought Thomas back, they would relocate the Civil Affairs Bureau so they could register their marriage immediately. Had it been before, Fiona would never have accepted marrying her younger brother-in-law. But she and Thomas had been husband and wife for nearly 2 years. Not only had her body grown accustomed to him, but even her heart had gradually come to belong to him. Since her reputation was already ruined, she might as well marry him and have children. At least their future life would have some security. So Fiona arrived. She had prepared herself for every reaction Thomas might have when he saw her. But she never imagined he would act so wildly the moment they met. He held her tightly, kissed her passionately, begging her not to leave him. His passionate display left her momentarily stunned, as if they had been swept back into those sweet 2 years together. At the thought, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She lifted her head, wrapped her arms around his neck, and was about to kiss him. But in the next moment, Thomas suddenly shouted another woman's name at her. Veronica, don't go. I beg you. Crash! The moment the name Veronica slipped from his lips, it was like a bucket of ice-cold water poured over Fiona's head, freezing her to the bone. In that instant, an indescribable surge of shame, anger, and hurt welled up inside her. She had already come to see herself as his. Why then would he call out another woman's name? At that thought, she could no longer contain herself. Drawing strength from nowhere, she shoved Thomas away with all her might. Thomas, look at me closely. Who exactly am I? Thomas was holding Veronica, kissing her with abandon, when he was suddenly pushed away. He didn't immediately react and reached instinctively for Fiona's hand. Veronica, please don't be angry, all right? I can explain everything. Thomas. Another desperate cry echoed, and this time, Thomas finally regained his senses. He shook his head and at last saw clearly who stood before him. In an instant, the madness and passion that had flooded his face receded like a tide, leaving only cold indifference. Why is it you? Chapter 26. Gazing at Thomas's distant and cold tone, Fiona felt a sharp ache in her heart. She pinched the palm of her hand. Yet in the end, she relayed Sanchez's mother's decision to him in full. When he heard that Sanchez's mother wanted him to marry Fiona, Thomas's expression immediately darkened. His eyes were devoid of warmth, and his voice remained flat. And you? Do you also wish to marry me? Fiona looked at the face before her, identical to that of her late husband, and nodded almost involuntarily, as if compelled by some unknown force. One of the main reasons she agreed to marry brother Thomas back then was because she was drawn to that face. Even if Thomas did not love her, possessing that face meant that if she later had a son who resembled him, it wouldn't be a loss for her. But she could not say that. I told you, with my reputation now, no one would want to marry me. If I don't marry you, then who else could I marry? After hearing this expected answer, Thomas felt utterly exhausted. Had he known back then that, to give Fiona a reason to keep living and to bring peace to his elder brother, impersonating his brother to be with her and father a child would cause so much trouble, he would never have done it. No matter what. He leaned back onto the bed, closed his eyes, and rubbed the bridge of his nose, his voice heavy with resignation. But you know very well that I don't like you, and there's no way I would marry you. All the kindness I once showed you is only because of my elder brother. Besides, I came to the island this time to win back Veronica, to be reunited with her as a married couple. Since Veronica entered his life, Thomas's gaze has never fallen on anyone else. Hearing Thomas say this, Fiona could only feel a sharp sense of bitter irony. Since arriving on the island, she had specifically inquired about Veronica's situation. Now she is not only married to Albert but also expecting a child. Their bond is so strong that no one could possibly come between them. Fiona couldn't deny her jealousy, but she had no time for it. Her urgent concern was to keep Thomas firmly within her grasp, so she decided to snap him out of his daydream. Stop thinking about it. You can't win her back. Besides, If we're talking about married couples, I've spent more nights in bed with you than you have being married to her. Isn't it true that Thomas and Veronica, still newlyweds, were separated by their mission assignments, and not long after that incident occurred, even after his return, he kept making love to himself. Besides, we once had a child, Thomas. No woman would willingly look back at a man like you, except for me. It was unclear which word struck a nerve with Thomas, but the usually calm man suddenly flared up, grabbing something nearby and throwing it at Fiona. Enough! Get out of here! Get out! Meanwhile, Veronica remained unaware of what was happening between Thomas and Fiona. At this moment, under Albert's attentive care, the embryo portrait had stabilized. After having stayed at home for over a month, she was finally able to go out for a walk. On a sudden impulse, she insisted that Albert accompany her to the town to visit the newly opened department store, hoping to prepare some clothes and milk powder for the baby she was carrying. Because the department store was not far, they chose not to drive, instead strolling slowly down the mountain road. Along the way, Veronica was like a bird released from its cage, glancing here and there. Albert did not stop her, only followed closely, protecting her safety. After entering the department store, they went straight to the second floor to the shop selling mother and baby products. Not knowing whether the child she carried was a boy or a girl, they bought 2 sets of everything, but when they brought their pile of items to the counter to pay, the waiter told them someone had already settled the bill. Chapter 27. Veronica and Albert exchanged a glance, both eyes filled with confusion. They had neither recently helped anyone nor could anyone have kindly spent so much money on them without reason. At first, Veronica thought it was the waiter's prank, but when the waiter placed the bill before them, they had no choice but to accept it as true. Originally, the married couple believed this was merely an accident. Perhaps a friend had unexpectedly encountered them but, unable to greet them in person due to a lack of time, had chosen this indirect way of saying hello. Next time, if there's an opportunity, once they find out who it is, they should thank them in person. But who would have thought that at every new place they visited to buy something, this situation would repeat itself? Over time, Veronica grew increasingly uneasy. She looked at Albert with apprehension, a flood of dark thoughts racing through her mind. What if someone was deliberately setting them up? Compared to Veronica's fear, Albert remained far more composed. From these incidents, he had already roughly guessed who was behind them. Moreover, having just caught a glimpse of a familiar figure only confirmed his suspicions. With this thought, he comforted Veronica and took her to the newly opened restaurant for a meal. While waiting for the dishes to arrive, Albert casually found an excuse and told Veronica to begin eating. He would return shortly. In a narrow alley, Albert delivered a kick that knocked Thomas to the ground. His expression was icy, his dark eyes flickering with a hint of restrained anger. So it really was you. Thomas had left the hospital against medical advice before fully recovering, but after just one kick, he no longer had the strength to rise from the ground. Yet despite this, determination still stood firm on his face. So what if it's me? I've said Veronica is my wife, and no thief like you will ever take her away. To resolve the serious trouble with Fiona and to reclaim Veronica as soon as possible, Thomas slipped out of the hospital unnoticed. He searched and inquired all along until he finally found the Veronica he longed for, with Albert by her side. Unlike the radiant beauty she had at their first reunion, she now carried a quiet glow of motherhood, her abdomen gently swelling. That swollen belly felt like a sharp blade twisting his heart to pieces, and the bitter blood spread from his throat throughout his entire mouth. Yet Thomas forced himself to swallow this bitterness, for he was the one who had fathered a child with another woman first. Now, he was willing to accept her child as his own and raise the child as if it were his flesh and blood. But this was contingent on Veronica being willing to go with him. So, to convince her, he came up with a plan to send Albert away. But before he could go find Veronica, Albert, who had discovered him first, reached him ahead. Albert hadn't expected Thomas to be so brazen. Without a word, he swung a punch at him. At that moment, a deafening explosion echoed from afar. Bang! Albert's fist froze in midair. Turning around in disbelief, he saw the restaurant where he and Veronica had dined ablaze, thick smoke billowing like a giant hand that engulfed the entire building. Veronica! A guttural cry tore from his throat as he charged frantically toward the burning restaurant. Unnoticed, Thomas behind him turned pale as well, struggling to rise from the ground and giving chase. Amid the raging fire, mingled with cries and screams, the cacophony pounded painfully on Albert's forehead. Overwhelmed by boundless remorse, he raised his hand and struck himself hard twice. If only he had never abandoned Veronica. If anything happened to Veronica, he wouldn't want to live. With that thought, he recklessly charged into the flames. Chapter 28. Bang! Once again, a fierce explosion shattered the air, sending debris and fragments flying like lethal arrows in all directions. Comrade, calm down. It's far too dangerous inside. You'll be walking into certain death if you go in. We've already called the police. The rescuers will arrive any moment now. Those around saw Albert recklessly charging forward as if his life depended on it and hurriedly rushed over to stop him desperately. Let me go. My wife is still inside. And she's pregnant. Albert's eyes were bloodshot as he struggled fiercely against the crowd's restraint. At that moment, his mind was utterly blank, filled only with the desperate thought that Veronica was still inside. She must not suffer even the slightest harm. Get away! He knew not where the strength came from, but suddenly broke free from those around him and surged headlong into the raging flames. Comrade! Bang! Another violent explosion roared out, and the shockwave from the massive wave violently threw the entire group to the ground, plunging the scene back into chaos. But just then, a figure had already slipped stealthily into the blaze from the opposite side. Close behind, Thomas, upon hearing that Veronica was still trapped in the fire, threw caution to the wind and plunged without hesitation into the inferno. Though he had some experience rescuing people from fires, the blaze inside the restaurant at this moment was far too fierce. Amid swirling black smoke, figures covering their noses and wiping tears dashed past. Coughs rose relentlessly, mingling with the charred shadows carried by the flames, as desperate cries filled the air and frantic runners fled. And Thomas, having no time to prepare, was soon surrounded as the flames closed in around him. Beneath his feet, clusters of burning embers crumbled. Behind him, tongues of fire pursued without respite, while waves of searing heat crashed over him like a raging tide. As if he were trapped in an endless hell of terror, thick smoke was pouring into his mouth and nose, choking his airways and making it hard to breathe. Tears streamed down his face as his mind darkened in waves. He was barely able to make out the scene before him. The exposed skin on his body was blistered by the raging flames, the burning pain wrenching at his nerves and slowing his steps. He lost track of time until he finally saw a familiar figure curled up on the ground, motionless. Just as his heart began to settle, it suddenly clenched. Thomas could no longer hesitate and rushed forward. Suddenly, a charred piece of ceiling crashed violently down upon that figure. Veronica. Thomas rushed over and threw himself onto her. The next moment, the chunk of ceiling slammed heavily onto his back. Thud. In an instant, Thomas was plunged into darkness, completely losing consciousness. In the hospital, Fiona looked at the man lying in the hospital bed, his body completely swathed in bandages, her eyes filled with complicated emotions. She knew that Thomas still loved Veronica, but she never expected his love to be so profound. He loved her so deeply that, to win Veronica back, he secretly slipped out of the hospital despite not yet having fully recovered. His love was so intense that he risked his life to run into the flames to save Veronica, even if it was only someone with a silhouette resembling hers. The more Fiona dwelled on it, the tighter her hands clenched, even as her nails pierced her palms, breaking the skin and drawing drops of blood. She felt no pain. She stared motionless at Thomas, suddenly recalling the letter Mrs. Sanchez had sent not long ago. The letter suggested concern that she might not be able to bring Thomas back alone and that the Sanchez family would soon send someone to help her. But Mrs. Sanchez hoped that before anyone from the Sanchez family arrived on the island, she could be with Thomas once more, preferably conceiving a child in that encounter, so they would gain another advantage for the marriage. At the thought, Fiona absently touched her pocket, where the medicine Mrs. Sanchez had sent with the letter was kept. As for where to use it, Fiona is the one who knows best. She had even already decided where to put it to use. Thomas, you were the one who wronged me first, so don't blame me for treating you this way. Chapter 29. Thomas had been unconscious for an entire week, and the first thing he asked upon waking was not how long Fiona had stayed by his side. Instead, he inquired about Veronica's condition. when he learned that the person he saved was not Veronica, that Veronica had escaped long ago. He was first shocked and stunned, then he collapsed back onto the bed as if all his strength had drained away. Yet, a faint smile of relief curled at the corner of his mouth. That smile made Fiona's eyes ache as she watched from beside him, only strengthening her resolve to medicate him. Upon hearing that Veronica was also in this hospital, Thomas ignored his own wounds and forced himself out of bed to go see her. This time, Fiona did not try to stop him. She silently watched him leave. Images from the fire surged through his mind. Learning that Thomas had braved the flames alone to rescue Veronica inflicted more pain on Fiona than anyone else. By the time she arrived at the fire scene, Thomas had already entered. She was frantic, searching everywhere for the rescuers. Yet she soon realized that not far away, Veronica, who was supposed to be trapped in the fire, was tightly held, kissed, and comforted by Albert. After her initial shock, an inexplicable surge of anger and sorrow rose within her. If Thomas knew that the person he had desperately tried to save had long since escaped and was now in another man's embrace, what would he feel? Just as she was about to approach them, Albert spotted her first. After soothing Veronica in his arms and helping her into the car, he turned and approached her, saying he wanted to work together. The whole purpose was to make Thomas completely give up on Veronica, and Fiona agreed. The first step was to let Thomas hear that Veronica had utterly lost faith in him and would never turn back. Sure enough, just as Thomas was about to knock on the door of Veronica's ward while pushing the wheelchair, he overheard Albert mentioning him inside. Veronica, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Thomas. Immediately outside the door, Thomas halted his breath, his outstretched hand frozen midair. He hadn't appeared before Veronica in a long time, and was unsure how she would now react to him. Is it disgust, or something else? But in the end, Veronica's voice from behind the door was unusually calm. He's fine. Why bring him up? Just a few words made his heart suddenly shudder, followed by a piercing pain that spread throughout his entire body. Has she reached the point where she no longer even wants to mention him? The conversation inside continued, Veronica's tone remaining calm from beginning to end, as if she were recounting someone else's story. I told you, from the moment I agreed to marry you, he ceased to be part of my life, and Thomas, to me, had already perished in that mission. Everything that followed was merely the price I paid for my own blindness. Now I have opened my eyes and no longer pay any attention to matters concerning him. I only want to live well with you here and now. So you no longer hate him? Ha! Why would I waste my energy resenting someone who is dead? In just a few brief words, Thomas's already precarious heart was completely shattered, broken beyond repair. His face as pale as death. He closed his eyes, seated in his wheelchair. His hands were clasped tightly, the knuckles whitened from the strain, like a silent statue. The pitch-black room was thick with the heavy scent of alcohol. Thomas slumped on the floor, his eyes glassy and unfocused, the wine glass in his hand trembling, with numerous overturned bottles scattered at his feet. He kept downing the liquor while crying out Veronica's name. Bitter tears of regret welled from the corners of his eyes, mingling with the drink as they burned down his throat. The bitterness stabbed him like countless needles, piercing every inch of his body, making it difficult to breathe. He could no longer hold on and abruptly collapsed to the ground. Thud! The moment Thomas fell to the ground, shards from the shattered bottle and wine splashed into his eyes, blurring his vision. In a daze, he seemed to see Veronica slowly pushing open the door and walking toward him, just as when they had first married, sweetly calling his name and holding him tightly. Believing he was dreaming, he allowed himself complete surrender for once. Suddenly, he drew her into his arms and bent down to kiss her, only to taste a bitter sorrow upon his lips. Her mind, clouded with alcohol, became utterly chaotic. Thomas, believing she was merely crying, anxiously moved to the corner of her eye and kissed away her tears, softly comforting her. Be good. Don't cry. I'm here. Under the cool night sky, rain began to drizzle gently. The evening breeze swept through as the rain grew heavier, gradually masking the man's muffled groans and the woman's soft moans inside the house. Chapter 30. After a night of passion, Thomas woke from his hangover with a splitting headache. He struggled to open his eyes, only to find a woman lying in his arms, her face concealed by long hair. Her smooth, rounded shoulders bore vivid crimson marks, unmistakably revealing what had happened the night before. In that instant, Thomas's eyes widened sharply, his mind momentarily losing all sense. Then, the woman in his arms let out a faint moan and slowly raised her head to smile at him. Thomas. The once tranquil morning immediately descended into chaos. Thomas could never have imagined that one day he would be drugged and deceived by a woman. As the flames of anger blazed within him, a surge of sorrow erupted from his heart. He had once slept with Fiona solely to give her a child. Now, wholly intent on reclaiming Veronica, sleeping with Fiona again would mean that any chance with Veronica was gone forever. She cared so deeply about purity, how could she accept a version of him who had been with other women? He could no longer hold back his fury and seized Fiona by the throat. Furious, "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Yet the harder he squeezed, the louder and more maniacal Fiona's laughter became. Only after the utterly despised Thomas hurled her to the ground did she stop laughing and cough violently a few times, then raise her eyes to him with cold disdain. "Thomas, wake up, stop dreaming. Since you took it upon yourself to fake your death and assume your brother's identity to lie with me, any possibility between you and her has vanished completely. Moreover, I might already be carrying your child. If you refuse to come back with me to register our marriage, I will expose the photos of our bed to the world and let everyone, especially her, see exactly how you claimed me." "Enough. You've lost your mind." Thomas slapped sharply, his heart heavy with regret. If only he had known. If only he had known that today he would be torn apart from his wife and child. He never should have been so soft-hearted as to help Fiona. Fiona was struck so violently that she suddenly coughed up blood, the crimson staining her pale lips, making her appear even more frenzied and terrifying. "Thomas, I warn you once again, if we don't have the marriage certificate within 3 days, my people will deliver those photos to her. Then she will be implicated and publicly shamed. As for her child, you must accept your fate. Just like her. Accept your fate." Thomas stared at her unblinkingly, utterly still, his mind frantically searched for solutions. But in the end, he mournfully realized there was none. From the moment he heard Veronica speak those words outside the ward, every last tie of affection between them was completely broken. Now that Fiona is truly determined to do this, if it causes Veronica to lose the baby, he had already disappointed and saddened her enough. It could not go on any longer. If that's the case, then why didn't he? Seeing that he had murderous intent toward her, Fiona kindly reminded him, "Don't forget your parents." The tightly clenched fist suddenly relaxed, and Thomas's once straightened back completely gave way. A satisfied smile curved at the corner of Fiona's mouth. She knew he had yielded. Chapter 31. 3 days later, the Sanchez family came to the island specifically to bring Thomas and Fiona home. Seeing the two walking arm in arm and the marriage certificate in Fiona's hand, the Sanchez family exchanged glances and all let out a long sigh of relief. The ship's horns sounded, and thick black smoke billowed from the smokestack. Thomas stood on the deck, stroking the wedding ring in his hand, his eyes heavy with bitterness. When he and Veronica were married years ago, he had spent half a year's salary to craft this wedding ring for her. When he placed it on her finger, Thomas, usually as tough as nails, cried like a child. At that moment, he whispered countless sweet words and made many solemn vows. But in the end, he broke every one of those promises. He even betrayed the most fundamental trust between a married couple. So he truly deserves the fate he's met. At last, he cast the wedding ring into the sea, consigning to the depths not only the ring but also the marriage he had willfully destroyed. "Veronica, farewell. We shall never meet again." At Albert's residence, upon hearing that Thomas and Fiona had registered their marriage and left, Albert allowed himself the first genuine smile he had shown in days. He had finally driven him away for good. From now on, no one would ever compete with him for his wife. With that thought, he pressed several fierce kisses on the person peacefully sleeping in his arms. Annoyed, Veronica slapped him several times. "What's wrong with you this time?" Since she became pregnant, Albert had grown even more anxious than she was, and his mind seemed increasingly unsettled. Albert, having been struck by his wife, wore a mischievous grin. "It's nothing, just that the annoying flies have finally been driven away." Veronica rolled her eyes, turned to nestle into his embrace, closing her eyes once more, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. In truth, she had known for a long time that Albert was hiding something from her. and it was still connected to Thomas. At her wedding with Albert, she saw Thomas recklessly rushing toward her, but she had long since completely let go of him, so she paid him no mind. Even when Albert seized the chance while she was asleep to handle matters related to Thomas, she was fully aware of it. She even knew about Thomas leaving her a letter of apology, only to tear it up afterward. But she did not care, because she loved Albert and understood that his actions were for the sake of her and the child she was carrying. Because she simply did not care about Thomas at all. Whether he lived or died was of no concern to her. Now she only wished to cherish the man before her, to live well with him and their future child. Nothing more. She would ask for nothing else. 7 months later, Veronica and Albert's daughter was born. Perhaps because this child was so hard-won, they named their daughter Tion Ai, meaning heaven's precious love, a gift from above, their most treasured blessing. From the moment she was born, the child drew much attention and affection from many. On the day of their daughter's 1-month celebration, both sets of parents traveled thousands of miles to the island to honor the child. Along with the heavy gift came a letter. Mrs. Morales looked at her son-in-law, sighed deeply, and said, "I never meant to give this to you, but Sanchez's mother has been begging me persistently. You know Veronica's temperament. I don't want to upset her. Just read this letter and then burn it. Don't tell her." Years ago, after the scandal of Thomas faking his death and sleeping with his brother and sister-in-law came to light, the Morales family severed ties with the Sanchez family. Meeting again now. Everything had changed, both the people and the place. Albert nodded slightly, took the letter from Mrs. Morales's hand, and walked to a corner. He had assumed it was another sentimental letter from Thomas to Veronica, but to his surprise, it was an apology. The letter explained that after returning, Thomas was plagued by recurring nightmares, repeatedly reliving the day his brother died, countless times trying to alter his fate, only to fail every time. These prolonged nightmares took a toll on his mental health, causing him to mistakenly see Fiona as Veronica. At first, Fiona thought, with the child born, what else was there that she couldn't endure? But later, when he had Fiona's son address the woman in the photo, Veronica, as mother, Fiona completely lost her sanity. During the fight, both sustained severe injuries. Thomas broke his leg and became paralyzed from the waist down, while Fiona lost her sight and developed a mental illness. As for the child Fiona bore after being drugged, the trauma rendered him mute. Later, he was diagnosed with a severe heart condition, becoming a lifelong invalid at such a young age. Thomas wrote this letter not to seek pity, but to offer an apology. He said he was sorry to Veronica and did not dare ask for her forgiveness. He only hoped she could find peace thereafter. With all her suffering taken upon himself, Albert snorted coldly and carelessly cast the letter into the fire. In the distance, Veronica was waving at him while holding their daughter. He quickly walked over and embraced them both tightly. "Veronica, I am truly fortunate to have you and our daughter." Veronica smiled softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "I am also fortunate to have you and our daughter."